18 years ago, he left his bride at the altar. Now he sees her again, with 4 teenagers. What happens next takes them straight to court. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Courtney Donovan stood rigid at the front of a cramped family courtroom in downtown Minneapolis, her eyes fixed on a figure across the aisle, Patrick Miller. Under the fluorescent lights, the judge's voice echoed through the hush, requesting that both parties step closer. With each step forward, Courtney's grip on the folder of legal documents tightened, her mind flooding with a memory she had fought for nearly 2 decades to bury, the day she was left at the altar. She had been 24, radiant in a simple white gown, accented with lace. The small church was filled with loved ones, all waiting to witness the moment she and Patrick would vow to share a life. Instead, in place of wedding bells, the hush of confusion spread as a whisper passed from guest to guest. Patrick was gone. And then, a phone call confirmed the worst. He wasn't coming, and no one knew where he went. The devastation was swift and absolute. One moment she was a bride, in the next, she was utterly alone. Snapping back to the present, Courtney felt her heart race as the judge repeated the request. "Ms. Donovan, Mr. Miller, please approach." She managed a curt nod, forcing herself to walk the short distance to the bench, aware of Patrick matching her steps. Though 18 years had passed since that disastrous day, her stomach still knotted at the sight of him, tall, broad-shouldered, with strands of grey now woven into his once dark hair. She could sense the tension in his stance and the flicker of regret in his eyes. The judge asked a procedural question about upcoming hearings, but Courtney could barely focus. All she wanted was to get out of that courtroom. Hours later, back in the familiarity of her office at Precision Accounts, Courtney sat at her desk and exhaled, trying to chase away the lingering anxiety. Soft, late-afternoon light streamed through the wide windows, reflecting off neat stacks of client files. Everything in her life followed a carefully structured routine. Spreadsheets color-coded by priority, appointments fixed weeks in advance, even her lunch choices planned a month out. It was her way of keeping chaos at bay. Outside her office door, her efficient assistant and closest friend, Vivian Brooks, was speaking on the phone. Vivian, with her warm smile and empathetic nature, had been Courtney's ally since their college days. She had been by Courtney's side when the wedding was abruptly cancelled, and she had seen firsthand how the heartbreak hardened Courtney's resolve never to rely on anyone else. Behind Courtney's desk, a family photo was displayed in a simple frame. 4 bright-faced teenagers, each with a personality shining through. The twins, Carl and Noah, 17 years old, looked identical on the surface, both tall and lean, sharing the same ocean blue eyes and wavy brown hair, but they couldn't be more different in temperament. Leah and Emily, also 17, stood on either side of their brothers. Leah had her hair pulled back neatly, her dark locks framing coolly discerning blue eyes, while Emily wore a playful hint of color in her blonde hair, her expression open and curious. Their schedules were meticulously planned, just like every other aspect of Courtney's life. Carl and Noah had basketball practices, science club, volunteer shifts. Courtney tracked every hour. Leah's debate team commitments and Emily's art workshops were slotted in with the same care. In Courtney's world, predictability was key. She had lost trust in spontaneous emotions long ago. That evening, once she returned home to their orderly suburban house, Courtney found solace in routine. The entryway was spotless, shoes aligned by size. The living room boasted carefully arranged furniture, no clutter, no surprises. She could hear Emily's music from upstairs, a gentle strum of a guitar. Carl was likely at his desk doing homework, while Leah and Noah were comparing notes on their next school project. This was how she liked it, planned, peaceful, and firmly under control. Yet a single email threatened that fragile sense of equilibrium. As Courtney opened her inbox, she spotted the subject line, "Welcome to the Minneapolis Commercial Association, new members roster." Skimming through, she recognized several names from local businesses. Then she saw it. Patrick Miller, Miller and Associates. Her breath caught. In the same day, she had stood in court with the man who had once shattered her world, and now she was seeing him surface again in her professional sphere. Minneapolis was a sprawling city, yet it felt impossibly small in this moment. She clenched her jaw, rereading the message. The upcoming networking event listed next week seemed inevitable. For an instant, she closed her eyes. Flashes of the church, the wedding gown, the pitying looks from friends and family returned. Then, the memory of her positive pregnancy test and the steely determination that followed hardened her resolve. She had raised 4 children alone. She had built a career single-handedly. She would face Patrick if she had to, just like she had done in court today, and just as she had done in the past, alone and unafraid. But as she powered down her computer, a tremor of unease ran through her. 18 years had passed without an apology or explanation, and now he was here, back in Minneapolis. At the same time, she stood at the peak of her carefully managed life. Courtney inhaled slowly. For better or worse, the past she had long buried was awakening, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Yet readiness no longer mattered. The challenge had arrived, and there was no turning away. Early the next morning, Courtney slipped into her office before sunrise, determined to tackle her work and banish the unsettling thoughts of Patrick. She booted up her computer with brisk efficiency, reviewing a list of pending tax filings and payroll tasks for local clients. Numbers had always been her refuge, steady, predictable, and devoid of emotional surprises. Still, every now and then, her mind betrayed her, wandering back to the news of Patrick's arrival in the city. The email announcing his membership in the Minneapolis Commercial Association brought an uncomfortable stir of memories she wished would remain locked away. All through breakfast, she'd forced bright conversation with the kids, asking about upcoming exams and extracurriculars, as if everything was fine. But even they had noticed her slightly tense demeanor. "Court, you in there?" Vivian's familiar voice drifted through the door. She stepped inside, delicate silver bracelets jangling at her wrist, her gaze narrowing with concern. Vivian had known Courtney far too long for polite small talk. "You haven't touched your second cup of coffee yet," she noted, pointing to the untouched mug on Courtney's desk. "And that's not normal." Courtney let out a short sigh. "You saw the roster from the Commercial Association, right? Patrick Miller is joining." She paused, gripping the edge of her desk. "Viv, I've done everything I can to keep my life stable for the kids and for myself. Now he shows up out of nowhere." Vivian shut the office door gently. "He's not out of nowhere. It's his hometown. His father passed away. He might be taking over the firm. You knew it could happen." Her tone was gentle but firm. "Are you more upset that he's here, or that this might force you to revisit old wounds?" Courtney's jaw tightened. She recalled how Vivian was there that day at the church, sharing the humiliating aftermath when the guests filtered out, stunned into pitying silence. Vivian stayed at Courtney's side through the heartbreak, then through the early months of Courtney's pregnancy with the quads, offering comfort and reassurance. But no matter how much time had passed, the ache of betrayal still pulsed. "I've moved on," Courtney insisted, though her voice wavered. "I raised my kids alone and built a life. The last thing I need is him wandering into it." Later, during lunch, Courtney found herself thinking about the flashbacks that haunted her every quiet moment. A fleeting image of herself at 24, tossing sleeplessly on the couch in her tiny studio apartment, pregnant with quads, no one's hand to hold. She had endured the pitying stares at the grocery store, the hushed gossips. Poor girl was left at the altar, and now she's expecting four. The memory made her stomach clench. When she returned home that evening, the air felt uneasy. She'd planned the usual family dinner, but found her energy faltering. The teens, ever perceptive, seemed to notice. Emily was the first to speak as they gathered around the table. "Hey, Mom, everything okay? You look stressed." Courtney smoothed her blouse and mustered a reassuring tone. "Oh, it's just work deadlines." She forced a small laugh, picking at her salad. "Nothing you kids need to worry about." Noah, usually reserved, cleared his throat. "I heard there's a new lawyer in town named Miller," he commented casually. "Someone in my debate club mentioned he might be volunteering at the school's upcoming career day. I guess he's from a family of attorneys." At the mention of the name Miller, Courtney's fork clattered against her plate, and her children exchanged glances. An awkward stillness spread over the table. Leah was the first to break the silence, her brow creasing with concern. "Is everything all right?" Courtney gave a tight nod, exhaling carefully. "Yes, I'm fine. But we'll talk about that another time." She saw their curiosity spark, but they knew better than to push. She swiftly changed the subject, turning the conversation toward weekend activities and chores. Later that night, with the kids upstairs, Courtney slipped into her bedroom closet. She pulled down a dusty shoebox hidden behind neatly stacked sweaters. Inside were fragments of the past she seldom allowed herself to view, letters she had never mailed, pictures from better days, and most painful of all, the faint pink lines on a torn pregnancy test she had taken 18 years ago. She remembered how her heart had pounded in her chest at the realization she was carrying not one baby, but four. Among the items was a single Polaroid of her and Patrick, taken months before the wedding. His arm draped around her shoulders, her face radiant with hope. An old wave of heartbreak resurfaced, but she closed her eyes and inhaled, mustering the steely will that had carried her through single motherhood. The phone buzzed with a message, another reminder from the Commercial Association about the upcoming meet and greet. She stared at Patrick's name in the list of new attendees. Her heart pounded. Regardless of how fiercely she tried to barricade herself from the past, it seemed determined to find her again. The question was whether she'd have the strength to keep her hard-earned equilibrium intact when it did. Patrick Miller leaned against the paneled walls of his late father's law office, gazing at the rows of diplomas and aging photographs. The old wood furniture smelled faintly of polish and dust, reminding him of afternoons spent here as a boy, watching his father, William Miller, juggle client meetings and phone calls with unwavering poise. Now the space was his to command, an unsettling inheritance he hadn't foreseen reclaiming so soon. He ran a hand through his hair, still adjusting to the streaks of gray that had multiplied in the past few years. He'd been in Chicago for nearly 2 decades, building a reputation in corporate litigation, intentionally putting distance between himself and the events he couldn't bear to face in Minneapolis. But William's passing had forced his hand. The firm, Miller and Associates, was in disarray after months of his father's illness. Patrick's sense of duty, complicated by guilt, brought him home. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the day 18 years ago when he made the worst decision of his life. He had paced in that same office, tie undone, heart pounding, convinced he was not ready to be a husband or a father if Courtney's whispered suspicions about a possible pregnancy were true. The weight of his father's expectations had crushed him. Was he capable of upholding the Miller legacy, taking on a family, and being the man everyone needed him to be? That morning, he'd chosen flight over courage. A hesitant knock on the door made him jump slightly. Marcus Green, his 30-something assistant lawyer, pushed the door open with a stack of files in hand. "These are the clients that stuck with the firm during your father's illness," Marcus explained, placing the papers on a heavy mahogany table. "And here," he handed over another folder, "is the list of networking events you asked for, including the Minneapolis Commercial Association meeting next week. There's a note about a meet and greet with local business owners." Patrick's expression flickered. "Right," he muttered. "I remember. I'll attend." He paused, drumming his fingers on the table. "One of those business owners will likely be Courtney Donovan," he said, his tone subdued. Marcus's eyebrows rose. "Donovan? That name sounds familiar." He rummaged through the list. "Yes, she's the owner of Precision Accounts. Seems well established. I'm guessing this is someone you know personally." For a moment, Patrick weighed how much to reveal. Marcus was capable and loyal, but Patrick was still grappling with his own turmoil. "We were engaged once," he finally admitted. "I ended it badly." "She's probably not thrilled to see my name on that roster." Marcus shifted uneasily, sensing the undercurrent of regret in Patrick's words. "Well, if you want to rebuild the firm's reputation, you'll need to attend these gatherings. But if it gets too personal, I can go in your stead." Patrick shook his head. "No, this is my responsibility. If she's there, I'll deal with it." He forced a confident smile, ignoring the knot twisting in his stomach. Left alone again, he moved to the windows, looking out over the busy Minneapolis streets. He'd spent years living with the guilt, telling himself it was too late to make amends. But stepping back into this city made every regret more vivid. He wondered how Courtney had coped, whether she had married someone else or even had the children she once suspected she was carrying. The sense of dread and curiosity mingled until he could hardly breathe. Despite his anxiety, he dove into the stack of files, trying to bury himself in immediate tasks. He glimpsed a photo of his father with colleagues at a bar association event, recalling how William had barked at him for leaving his fiancée. His father's disapproval remained etched in Patrick's mind. William had poured all his energy into shaping Patrick into the next big legal name, leaving little room for emotional support. Finishing the day's tasks later than he intended, Patrick locked up the office. The corridor felt ghostly and quiet. On his way out, he paused at the large portrait of William Miller in the lobby. The older man stared back, stern and imposing even in the oil painting. Patrick recalled the last days of William's life, how he had softened just enough to say he was sorry for pushing too hard. Yet no mention had been made of Courtney, or any attempt to reach her on Patrick's behalf. Stepping into the cool evening air, Patrick inhaled deeply. Chicago had been a place of escape, but Minneapolis was filled with unhealed wounds, and possibly revelations. If Courtney had indeed been pregnant, he might have a child somewhere in this city, almost an adult now. He chastised himself for not reaching out sooner, for allowing fear to dictate his choices. He walked down the sidewalk, passing bustling restaurants and cafes. Snippets of laughter and conversation drifted through the air, a hum of ordinary life. Somewhere in this same city, Courtney was living her own version of ordinary, minus the illusions she once harbored of him as a trustworthy partner. As he climbed into his car, Patrick's resolve crystallized. He had run away once before, but this time he would confront the truth, whatever it cost him. The grand ballroom of the Hotel Marquis was alive with the murmur of well-dressed professionals mingling beneath crystal chandeliers. Courtney arrived in a crisp grey blazer, her hair swept neatly behind her ears. She kept her posture stiff, scanning the crowd for potential clients, and for Patrick. Vivian accompanied her, both of them wearing name badges from Precision Accounts. "Remember, you're in control," Vivian murmured gently as they walked across the shiny marble floor. "You belong here just as much as he does." Courtney offered a taut smile, nodding. She could handle this, she told herself. For the first half hour, she mingled gracefully with familiar faces from the local business community, exchanging pleasantries about tax changes and finance updates. Still, her pulse quickened every time she heard a baritone voice that might be Patrick's or glimpsed a tall silhouette out of the corner of her eye. Sure enough, Patrick arrived a short while later, stepping in with measured confidence. He wore a sharp navy suit, and though Courtney tried not to stare, she couldn't help noticing the subtle lines of anxiety in his face. He paused near the entrance, scanning the attendees until his gaze settled on her across the room. Their eyes locked momentarily, a current of unspoken tension passing between them. Courtney felt a tightening in her chest, but she lifted her chin in defiance. The meeting began with formal introductions of new members. A hush fell as the speaker announced, "And we have Patrick Miller, who has recently taken over Miller and Associates." Courtney felt her cheeks flush when polite applause followed. She watched Patrick stride to the small stage, the same assured stance she remembered from years past. "Good evening," he began, voice resonating through the microphone. "My father ran Miller and Associates for decades, and I'm honored to continue his legacy here in Minneapolis." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd until his eyes landed on Courtney again. "It's a pleasure to join all of you. I look forward to serving our community as best I can." The applause resumed, and Courtney forced herself to join in, keeping her expression neutral. When the formalities ended, people dispersed for networking and cocktails. An uneasy game of avoidance began. Courtney tried to circulate around the far side of the room, chatting with a potential client about payroll management. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Patrick drifting closer. He was cornered by a well-meaning accountant who praised William Miller's contributions to local charities. Moments later, a mutual acquaintance, oblivious to the tension, waved both Courtney and Patrick over to the same conversation circle. "Courtney, have you met Patrick Miller? He's just rejoined the city's legal scene." Courtney swallowed, turning to face him. "Yes, she began, her throat dry. "We've met." She offered a tight smile, trying to maintain decorum. Patrick inclined his head politely. "Courtney Donovan, from Precision Accounts, right? Good to see you again." His gaze flicked, carrying a weight of memories that no polite introduction could mask. Their acquaintance, a jovial man named Glenn, beamed, oblivious. "That's great. Two top professionals in the same room. You folks could collaborate on something, I'm sure." "The association loves to see synergy." Courtney forced a professional laugh. "Indeed, we'll see what comes up." Vivian, sensing Courtney's discomfort, gently steered Glenn away under the pretext of wanting to discuss some tax matter. That left Courtney and Patrick standing in awkward silence, away from the main bustle of the event. The music from a small jazz ensemble provided a subtle backdrop. Patrick cleared his throat. "Courtney?" he began quietly. She stiffened. "Let's keep it brief," she cut in, determined not to show vulnerability. "We're both professionals here." He nodded, pressing his lips together. She noticed how he paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "I'm sorry to corner you like this," he continued softly, "but I've been wanting to say—" Courtney raised a hand in a subtle gesture of restraint. "Not here." The swirl of people around them made it impossible to speak freely, and Courtney preferred not to share personal matters in a public setting. She forced a smile, speaking just loudly enough to be heard above the saxophone's melody. "We're in a business association meeting, Mr. Miller. Let's keep our personal history out of it." His jaw tensed slightly, but he nodded. "Fair enough." She was about to step away when he added, in a voice barely audible, "You look well, Courtney." A complicated mix of anger, regret, and residual affection flickered across her features. She exhaled, then turned on her heel, crossing the room to chat with another contact. Patrick stood there for a moment, letting the fragments of unspoken words settle. He couldn't quite shake the heavy feeling of all that remained unresolved. On the drive home, Courtney replayed the encounter in her mind, her thoughts swirling with old betrayals and new uncertainties. She couldn't deny the reality. Patrick was here, in Minneapolis, playing a role in the same professional circle she inhabited. Whether she liked it or not, their paths would continue to intersect. And underneath her defensive exterior, a sliver of dread whispered that their unfinished story might soon rewrite itself in a way she wasn't ready to confront. It was a late afternoon when Patrick, still dressed in his suit from the association meeting, found himself back in the quiet hush of his father's office. The conversation with Courtney lingered in his mind, those tense words, her guarded expression. He'd waited almost 2 decades to see her again, but now that he had, the encounter left more questions than answers. He settled at his desk and flipped open his laptop, determined to sift through the local online community sites. Maybe it was foolish, but he couldn't resist. A part of him needed to piece together who Courtney had become in his absence. Typing her name into a search bar brought up professional listings for precision accounts, a handful of news articles praising her meticulous work, and a few photos from a recent Minneapolis business expo. In each picture, she stood poised and self-assured, the hints of warmth in her expression guarded. But in one snapshot, captured from a school fundraiser, he spotted 4 teenagers beside her, 2 boys and 2 girls. His eyes narrowed, heart pounding as he scrutinized the photo. A note in the caption named them Carl, Noah, Leah, and Emily Donovan, all 17. He zoomed in until the pixels blurred. Both boys had brown hair and intense blue eyes that looked so unnervingly like his own. A strange rush of recognition filled him, a blend of shock, excitement, and creeping dread. Suddenly, the math clicked. 17 years old. Courtney had been left at the altar 18 years ago, and now these kids had features he couldn't deny. No, he muttered under his breath, though he knew the truth was glaringly obvious. A swirl of conflicting emotions invaded him, anger that he had never been informed, guilt for having run away, and an odd surge of paternal protectiveness he had no idea how to express. He slammed the laptop shut, leaning back in his chair, breathing heavily. If these were his children, it meant he had lost almost 2 decades of their lives. He debated what to do next. Confront Courtney directly, demand an explanation. What right did he have after disappearing so abruptly? Yet what right did she have to keep them hidden? Thoughts of fatherhood had paralyzed him all those years ago. But now, the missed birthdays, the first steps never witnessed, the bedtime stories untold, stacked in his mind like a tower of regret. Darkness fell outside, and the overhead office light cast a stark glare on the neatly organized desk. After pacing the room restlessly, Patrick picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew from memory, the county records office. Though it was after hours, the automated system gave instructions on how to request birth certificates online. He scribbled notes, face set with grim determination. By morning, he'd have a formal request submitted. The next day brought the inevitable confirmation. The official record stated no father was listed for Carl, Noah, Leah, or Emily Donovan. Patrick's name was conspicuously absent on all 4 certificates. He felt the blow like a punch to the gut. Evidently, Courtney had never attempted to include him, never forced him to pay child support or even sign the birth documents. She had chosen total independence. Perhaps it was out of necessity, or perhaps out of anger, maybe both, but the result was the same. He was a stranger to his own children. After hours of agonized deliberation, Patrick decided to consult someone more knowledgeable about this kind of situation. He called an old law school friend, Elaine Carter, now a reputable judge in family court. He requested an informal meeting in her chambers. Elaine greeted him warmly, but her eyes were sharp with curiosity when he explained the paternity bombshell. "Patrick," she said, steepling her fingers, "you can't just show up one day and expect everything to be fine. You left her, remember? If you file for a paternity test or recognition of parental rights, you're talking about forcing a major legal confrontation." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but they're my kids." "I can't walk away again," Elaine nodded. "Just be prepared. This is going to dredge up a lot of pain for Courtney and for the children. They might feel betrayed. They might even resent you. Legally, you have grounds to establish paternity, but emotionally, you're on shaky terrain." Her words weighed heavily, yet Patrick felt an odd sense of purpose forming. He'd made the mistake of fleeing from responsibility once. Now it seemed the only path left was to accept it, no matter how complicated it became. That evening, he sat alone in his apartment, the one he'd rented near the old Miller home. Staring at a photograph on his phone, those 4 teenagers standing beside Courtney, he fought back a surge of remorse. He whispered into the empty room, "I'm sorry, but apologies spoke to no one here." There was only the echo of his own voice, and the knowledge that once he set this legal process in motion, there would be no turning back. Still, if he had a chance to be part of their lives, however belatedly, he had to take it. He drafted an email to a local law firm that handled paternity cases, then hesitated before pressing send. The act felt monumental, a step into a future filled with uncertainty. He clicked the mouse. The message was gone, irretrievable. Patrick closed his laptop and sank into a chair, heart pounding with a curious blend of dread and hope. The moment he'd feared for years had arrived. A reckoning with the past, shaped by 4 young lives he had never met but already felt bound to protect. One way or another, he would uncover the truth and face Courtney with everything he had once tried so desperately to avoid. Late on a Sunday afternoon, Patrick guided his car along the winding streets leading to his mother's home on the outskirts of Minneapolis. Margaret Miller lived in a tidy, single-story house, trimmed with rose bushes. She still tended herself at age 68. The warm light through her living room windows beckoned him in, though he couldn't ignore the simmer of dread tightening his chest. He'd returned to Minneapolis only weeks ago, but the toll of guilt and unanswered questions had already begun to weigh heavily on him. Margaret opened the front door before he even had time to knock. She stood in a peach-colored cardigan, hair elegantly styled in silver waves, her expression a mix of warmth and disapproval. "Patrick," she greeted, embracing him briefly. "I'm glad you finally decided to come by." "It's been too long." Patrick stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of his mother's home, a subtle blend of lavender and the lemon furniture polish she used for years. His eyes swept across the hallway walls where old family photos hung, capturing fleeting moments of happier, simpler times. Margaret led him to the couch and poured them both tea. She studied her son's drawn face, sensing the turmoil beneath his measured calm. "William's passing has changed everything for you, hasn't it?" she asked softly. "More than I expected," Patrick admitted, looking away. The mention of his father stirred emotions he could hardly articulate. William Miller had been a man of unwavering standards, strong opinions, and overwhelming expectations. Even in death, his presence loomed over Patrick's decisions. Margaret sat beside him, laying a hand on his arm. "You know, before he passed, your father spoke about you often. He regretted many things, especially the pressure he put on you." She paused, letting the silence fill with significance. "He also worried there was more to your flight 18 years ago than just cold feet." Patrick swallowed hard. "Mom, I was terrified of disappointing him." of not living up to the Miller reputation. But mostly, I was afraid I wasn't ready to be a father, Margaret exhaled gently. He always suspected that your leaving Courtney wasn't the full story. I think deep down, he sensed she might have been pregnant. She looked searchingly at her son. Is it true? Patrick nodded, guilt twisting his features. She has 4 kids, 17 years old, and there's a chance. No, not a chance. I'm certain they're mine. Margaret's eyes flickered with heartbreak. Oh, Patrick, you may have lost years with them, but maybe there's time to make it right. He pulled a plain white envelope from his pocket, the edges worn from frequent handling. Dad never gave you this, did he? He asked quietly. Her brow furrowed as she slid her reading glasses on and examined the envelope. Inside was a letter Patrick had penned to Courtney nearly 2 decades ago. He'd written it a few weeks after he fled. A raw apology and an admission of regret. William mentioned a letter you wrote, she murmured, her voice trembling, but he never showed it to me. I guess he thought it was for the best, or he feared Courtney might try to... I don't know. Maybe he believed she wanted to trap me. I'll never fully understand why Dad did what he did. Patrick's voice cracked with frustration, but I can't stand by now. They're my children, and I've never been there. I came here to ask you, am I insane for pursuing this legally? For forcing Courtney and the kids into a confrontation, Margaret sighed, placing the letter gently on the coffee table. No, but it won't be easy. You did abandon her, son. And while I might have disapproved of how you handled things, you're my child. I understand your fears. She leaned back, speaking carefully. Courtney raised those kids alone. She must be strong, maybe even hardened by what happened. You need to be prepared for her anger. Patrick buried his face in his hands. I'm furious at her for hiding them from me, but I also know it's my fault she had to manage alone. Part of me wants to march over and demand to see them. Another part knows I have no right. Margaret placed a firm hand on his shoulder. You have every right to be in their lives now, Patrick, but only if you're willing to do the hard work. Your father's legacy was law. But he forgot that relationships require more than court orders. They require humility, sincerity, and time. His mother's words settled a measure of clarity into Patrick's racing thoughts. He had spent so long resenting his father, angry at Courtney, and angry at himself. Now the path forward required him to confront all those tangled threads. I don't know where to start, he admitted. Margaret sipped her tea, her eyes glistening with compassion. Start by not running away this time. There's a battle coming, legal or otherwise. Stand your ground and be honest. Show Courtney and those children who you truly are, flaws and all. They talked until late in the evening, going over potential scenarios, discussing resources, and exchanging quiet regrets. By the time Patrick finally stepped out into the cool night air, he clutched the unopened letter and felt a renewed sense of purpose. His mother's final remark echoed in his mind. Your past defines who you were. What you do now defines who you can become. He nodded silently in agreement, determined to be braver than the man who had once disappeared in the face of fatherhood. The next morning, Patrick found himself in a cramped waiting area of the Hennepin County Government Center, shoulders tense as he stared at a poster that read, Vital Records Division. A few residents lined up behind him, each clutching documents of their own. Birth certificates, passports, marriage licenses. He couldn't help but wonder how many stories intersected here and how many secrets were sealed by official paperwork. When it was his turn, he approached the counter and cleared his throat. I need to look up birth records, he said, sliding over a list of names he had printed out. Carl Donovan, Noah Donovan, Leah Donovan, Emily Donovan. The clerk, a young woman with short red hair, typed away on her computer. After a brief pause, she nodded. Each of these records is missing a father's name. If you're looking for more detailed information, you'll need to fill out these forms. She handed him a small packet, one for each child. Patrick's heart pounded as he took the papers. "Thank you," he murmured, stepping aside to fill them out, double-checking every line to avoid mistakes. He felt the weight of this moment. 18 years ago, he had fled from the possibility of fatherhood. Now, ironically, the reality was all he wanted to claim. Later, he walked out into the brisk Minneapolis air, the completed forms in hand. His phone vibrated, and he answered to hear the voice of an old law school friend, Judge Elaine Carter, calling to confirm their casual lunch meeting. "We can talk off the record," she reminded him. "But remember, if you decide to make this official, you're stepping onto a chessboard." That afternoon, Patrick met Elaine in a corner booth at a quiet diner. They exchanged pleasantries, old jokes from law school, updates on mutual acquaintances, until she set down her coffee cup, all seriousness. "So, you believe you're the father of these 4 teenagers, and you're ready to move forward?" He told her about the birth certificate findings, the timeline, and the faces that looked so much like his in the photos. As he spoke, Elaine's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Legally, you can file a petition to establish paternity," she said, "but it's more than just a signature on a form. If Courtney doesn't cooperate, this could become a contentious case. Are you prepared for that?" Patrick inhaled slowly. "I can't walk away again. Yes, I'm prepared to go through whatever it takes." Elaine nodded. "I respect that, but be careful. The court system is designed to protect children's interests. Right now, those kids have had their mother as the sole authority figure. Sudden changes can be traumatic for everyone involved." She paused, leaning forward. "And remember, you left Courtney. You can't erase that fact from anyone's mind, especially hers." His shoulders slumped. "I know, but she also hid them from me, Elaine. She didn't put my name on their birth certificates. She never tried to reach me. I have a right to be upset." Elaine offered a tight smile. "You do, but the court will look at the entire picture. If her reason for withholding your name was because you abandoned her, a judge might consider that she was protecting herself or the children from further instability." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "Then I'll make a case for my sincerity now. I have a solid career, a home. I'm ready to be a father." "It's not that simple," she warned. "But I can introduce you informally to one of my colleagues, a fair judge who specializes in complex custody and paternity cases. Heather Montgomery. She's meticulous and tough, but she values genuine attempts at resolution." By the time Patrick left the diner, he felt more resolute and more aware of the mountain he had to climb. That evening, he returned to Miller & Associates, the law firm now under his reluctant leadership. He carefully typed up a formal petition to establish paternity and custody rights, referencing the Minnesota statutes that protected paternal rights. His mind buzzed with conflicting emotions, anger, sorrow, and a flicker of hope. The next day, he contacted a process server to handle the paperwork. With a sense of finality, Patrick handed over the sealed documents. "Deliver these to Courtney Donovan," he said, voice tense. "Make sure she signs for it personally." The server nodded and left. Patrick stayed behind in his office, staring at the empty reception chair once occupied by his father's longtime secretary. He braced himself for the tempest that was about to hit both his life and Courtney's. "This time," he thought, "I won't run. I'll face the consequences." He whispered those words into the silent room, unsure if they were a reassurance or a plea. Either way, the die was cast. He had initiated a legal process that couldn't be undone with a simple apology. There would be no turning back now. Courtney was halfway through reviewing a large client's tax returns when the knock on her office door startled her. She glanced at the clock. 10 minutes until noon. Vivian had stepped out for lunch, and the rhythmic hum of the printer was the only sound besides her own heartbeat. Standing, she opened the door to a professionally dressed man holding a clipboard. "Courtney Donovan?" he asked in a flat tone. She nodded. "Yes." He extended a manila envelope. "You've been served." With that curt statement, he offered a brief nod and left, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hallway. A chill spread through Courtney's limbs as she turned the envelope over, reading the printed label from Miller and Associates. The name alone sent her heart into overdrive. She swallowed, shutting the door before sinking into the chair. Her hands trembled as she slid a finger under the seal. Inside were official-looking documents bearing the bold heading, "Petition to establish paternity and custody rights. Patrick Miller, petitioner." For a moment, her vision blurred. Her thoughts whirled, returning to memories of that day, standing in a wedding gown, phone in hand, face flushed with the sting of betrayal, the empty altar, the questions that never had answers. She scanned the legal jargon, reading how Patrick sought recognition as the father of her 4 children, who were collectively nearing adulthood. The lines read, cold and formal. "Petitioner requests a judicial order for DNA testing, for determination of fatherhood, for future custody or visitation arrangements." Rage flared hot beneath her shock. How dare he? He left 18 years ago without a backward glance, and now he was forcing his way into the children's lives at the very brink of their adulthood. Courtney fought a wave of panic, her mind racing through possible responses. Could she ignore it? No. These were official court papers. She had a limited window to respond, or risk the court ruling in his favor by default. She shoved aside a scatter of spreadsheets on her desk and reached for her phone. "Viv, get back to the office as soon as you can," she said into voicemail, her tone shaking. Then, with trembling fingers, she dialed Diana Wells, the attorney who had guided her through smaller civil matters in the past. Diana's firm, located a few blocks away, specialized in family law. Within the hour, Courtney was seated in Diana's office, the petitions spread out between them on a polished wooden table. Diana, a poised woman in her early 50s, scanned the pages, her brow creasing. "So he's claiming he had no knowledge of the children, wants DNA testing to confirm paternity, and is seeking some form of custody." Courtney nodded, swallowing back the tightness in her throat. "Yes, and I'm not sure what to do. I never put his name on any birth certificates, but I tried, once, to reach out to the Miller family. His father refused to speak with me, implied I was making up stories." She paused, pressing her lips together. "After that, I stopped trying. I had no resources, no way to chase him down in Chicago." Diana leaned forward, her expression a blend of empathy and determination. "Courtney, Minnesota law recognizes that both parents have responsibilities and rights toward their children. However, you've been the sole caregiver for 17 years. That counts for a lot. The court won't ignore his long absence. But what if they rule that he gets visitation? The kids are almost adults, but he could still disrupt everything. They're about to apply to colleges. We have a routine. My biggest fear is that he'll undermine the stability we've built." Courtney's eyes shone with a fierce protectiveness. She wasn't sure whether she was more afraid of Patrick's legal challenge or of the possibility that her children might want to know him. Diana inhaled slowly. Legally, the court often looks at the best interest of the children. If Patrick truly wants a relationship, it could be beneficial in some ways. But if you want to contest this, we can argue that his reappearance is too little, too late. We'll emphasize the emotional impact of his abandonment. Courtney felt her pulse throb. "Whatever it takes," she said in a low voice. "He can't just drop into their lives after being a ghost for almost 2 decades. I won't stand by and watch him hurt them." Diana nodded. "We'll respond to his petition. It's important we don't refuse the paternity test if the court orders it. That won't help, but we can certainly make a case for limited or supervised visitation, at least initially." She paused, scanning Courtney's face. "Have you told the kids?" Courtney's stomach twisted. "Not yet. I wanted to get some legal advice first. They've never asked about their father, at least not directly. They've always assumed the question was off limits." Diana exhaled, understanding the complexity. "It's going to be a shock for them. They may have questions, or they may have anger. You need to prepare yourself." By the time Courtney left Diana's office, her tears had turned to steel resolve. She gripped the envelope containing her copy of the petition, the legal lines feeling like an anvil dragging her down. As she headed back to her own office, she vowed not to let Patrick's sudden re-entry unravel the life she had carefully built. Yet an undercurrent of fear rippled within her. Fear that the children might resent her for not revealing the truth sooner. Fear of losing the structure she'd guarded so faithfully, and fear of facing the man who once shattered her world and was determined to be part of it again. Courtney's front door closed behind her with a dull thud, echoing in the otherwise quiet foyer. Evening darkness enveloped the suburban neighborhood, the porch light illuminating scattered autumn leaves on the driveway. Normally, she would have launched into her structured routine, reviewing the kids' homework logs, checking the mail, tidying up the living room. But tonight, her mind was elsewhere, consumed by the lines of Patrick's petition. She shrugged off her coat, hearing distant chatter and movement upstairs. Leah was likely in her bedroom reading or organizing tomorrow's study schedule, while Carl and Noah could be in the shared office corner they called the boys' zone. Emily might be lost in her art in the garage-turned-studio space. Courtney savored these predictable patterns, but tonight they felt fragile. She was about to call them all downstairs when Leah appeared at the top of the stairs, eyebrows drawn. "Mom, you're late. We were about to order takeout, but we weren't sure if you'd already eaten." Her steady, analytical gaze took in Courtney's strained expression. "Is everything okay?" Courtney managed a faint smile, her stomach twisting. She had told Diana she would wait for the official hearing before revealing too much, but her children weren't oblivious. Leah, in particular, had a knack for picking up subtle shifts in Courtney's mood. "I'm fine, just a long day," she said, forcing a casual tone. "Why don't we all get settled, and I'll talk to everyone together?" Minutes later, the 4 teenagers assembled around the kitchen island, each one slipping into their own persona. Carl in a sports sweatshirt, arms folded defensively, Noah with a notebook in hand, scribbling lines of a physics equation, Leah, leaning with an air of watchful concern, and Emily, whose eyes flitted anxiously between her siblings and their mother. Courtney inhaled, searching for words. "There's something I need to tell you. It's about your father." Her voice faltered on the last word, a term she had never uttered in front of them. A stunned silence followed. Emily blinked. "Our father? What about him?" Her tone was both curious and apprehensive. Courtney's gaze dropped to the countertop. "He's back in Minneapolis. He's filed some legal documents asking for a paternity test and possibly rights to see you." She swallowed hard, scanning their faces. Noah, the quiet intellectual, looked up from his notes. Confusion mingled with a flash of excitement. "He wants to see us now, after all this time?" The unspoken question was, "Why didn't you tell us before?" Carl clenched his jaw. "Mom, who is this guy? I mean, we never even knew his name." "You always said it was a dead subject." Leah set her phone down, eyes narrowing. "Patrick Miller, right?" she guessed. Courtney nodded slowly. and Leah's brow furrowed further. "I heard something at school about a new lawyer named Miller. People talked about him volunteering to help with a mock trial. That's him." Courtney nodded again. "It's complicated. He left before. I told him about you, but we never actually talked after that. I tried contacting his family once, but they shut me down." Her throat felt tight. "I didn't want you to grow up feeling rejected, so I never mentioned him." Emily took a tentative step toward her mother. "But he wants a DNA test, right? So that means—" "Yes, it means he's trying to prove legally that he's your father," Courtney answered. "He's also requesting visitation or custody. It's all in the court documents." Carl's face flushed. "After 18 years of zero contact, now he wants to play dad." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. "That's ridiculous." Leah glanced at Noah, who looked uneasy. "Do we have to meet him?" Leah asked. "Or do we get a say in this?" Courtney placed a hand on the counter to steady herself. "Legally, you're still minors. The court could order a process. But yes, your opinions matter a lot at your age. A judge will consider your wishes. My attorney wants to handle this carefully." A tense hush fell over the family. Emily broke it in a trembling voice. "So, when do we see him?" "I don't know yet," Courtney admitted, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. "We have to wait for the court's schedule. A hearing will be set to decide the next steps." Sensing the swirl of emotions, Courtney stepped around the island, pulling Emily into a hug. Leah and Noah exchanged glances, while Carl stood rigid, arms still folded. He looked away, refusing any show of vulnerability. It was clear that while curiosity flickered in some, anger and confusion dominated others. All at once, Courtney realized there was no easy way to navigate this. Every day would bring new discoveries, resentments, and questions. She tried to force a reassuring tone. "We're going to face this as a family," she said firmly. "I won't let him hurt you." But as she spoke, a niggling doubt crept in. Perhaps it wasn't Patrick's presence that could hurt them most. Perhaps it was the secrets she'd kept, and the possibility that her children might resent her more than the father they had never known. Courtney arrived at the Minneapolis family court for the preliminary hearing with Diana by her side, each step echoing on the marble floors of the long corridor. The large windows let in a pale morning light, illuminating the anxious faces of families waiting for their turn in court. Standing in the hallway, Courtney tried to steady her breathing, attempting to mask the turmoil that churned beneath her calm exterior. On the opposite side, Patrick stood with a new attorney, an older man with a crisp suit and a lined face. Courtney immediately guessed this was someone with experience in paternal rights cases. Vivian, who had come as moral support, leaned toward Courtney and murmured, "He means business, doesn't he?" Diana nodded, glancing at the older man. "That's James Harrington, a seasoned lawyer. He's been known to push aggressive strategies on behalf of fathers seeking to establish parental rights." She gave Courtney's arm a reassuring squeeze. "But we have solid grounds to argue his prolonged absence." The clerk called for everyone to enter the courtroom. The space was smaller than the typical large trial court, designed for more private family matters. A few rows of benches lined the back, where Vivian and Margaret Miller took seats, exchanging polite nods of acknowledgement, but remaining on opposite ends of the room. The tension in the air was thick. Courtney tried to avoid Patrick's gaze as they settled in. She couldn't help noticing how the lines of worry on his face sharpened each time he looked at her. If she wasn't feeling so betrayed and furious, she might have recognized a flicker of empathy for him. He, too, seemed overwhelmed by the gravity of what was unfolding. But bitterness overshadowed any sympathy she might have felt. Judge Heather Montgomery, a woman in her late 50s with short silver hair and an air of calm authority, presided over the hearing. She began by stating the case details. Patrick Miller has filed a petition to establish paternity for 4 minors, Carl, Noah, Leah, and Emily Donovan. Ms. Courtney Donovan opposes or challenges this petition. Her voice was clear and no nonsense. Diana rose, addressing the judge. Your Honor, Miss Donovan is the sole provider and caretaker for these children. Mr. Miller was absent from their lives for almost 18 years. My client questions the sincerity and timing of Mr. Miller's petition. James Harrington stood next. Your Honor, the question of sincerity is irrelevant. The law provides that any alleged biological parent may seek to establish paternity, particularly when the mother never disclosed the existence of the children. He shot Courtney a look that could have been interpreted as accusatory. Mr. Miller was never given notice these children existed. Courtney stiffened, pressing her lips into a thin line. She wanted to shout that she had tried to reach out, that she was dismissed by William Miller, that Patrick had abandoned her at the altar. But protocol demanded she stay silent until asked to speak. Judge Montgomery folded her hands. I understand there's disagreement about what attempts at contact were made in the past. That is not today's concern. The immediate question is whether the court should order paternity testing. If Mr. Miller is indeed the father, subsequent hearings will address custody, visitation, or any other relevant matters. Diana nodded. We have no objection to paternity testing, provided it's done through a reputable lab. We only want to ensure the process is fair and non-intrusive. James Harrington echoed agreement. Absolutely. My client is prepared to cover any costs. The judge made a note. Then I'll order the test. Both parties should coordinate with the court-appointed lab. Once results are confirmed, we'll schedule further proceedings. She glanced at Courtney and Patrick, her gaze stern. I also expect both parties to remember these are 4 teenagers who stand at the brink of adulthood. Their well-being is paramount. If the DNA test confirms Mr. Miller's paternity, we will proceed with discussions about how best to integrate him, or not, into their lives. With a sharp rap of her gavel, the session ended. The murmur of conversation and rustling of papers filled the small courtroom. Courtney exhaled, feeling as if she'd been holding her breath the entire time. It wasn't the outcome she feared most. There was no immediate order for visitation or custody. But it was the first undeniable step toward Patrick forging a place in their family's future. As the parties drifted into the hallway, Vivian made small talk with Margaret, who seemed both relieved and regretful. Patrick stepped toward Courtney, an apologetic expression crossing his face. For a moment, the swirl of tension muted around them. I never wanted it to be this way, he said quietly. I'm sorry. Courtney's shoulders tightened, and she replied in a low voice, You had a choice 18 years ago. Then she pivoted, walking away with Diana at her side, leaving Patrick staring after her. The older lawyer touched Patrick's arm as if to offer support, but Patrick's attention remained fixed on Courtney's retreating figure. Outside, a crisp breeze stung her cheeks. She drew in a deep breath, steeling herself for the next battle. They had only completed the first skirmish in what promised to be a tumultuous war, one that threatened to tear apart the tight-knit family she had built from scratch. 2 weeks later, Courtney braced herself against the chill as she guided Carl, Noah, Leah, and Emily into the sterile environment of the court-appointed testing facility. The building was a nondescript medical office on the outskirts of Minneapolis. A swirl of mixed emotions roiled within Courtney: anger, anxiety, and an odd sense of inevitability. She felt particularly uneasy about this meeting because Patrick would be there, though the lab staff promised to keep the interactions minimal. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly. A receptionist greeted them, directing the 5 of them to a waiting room lined with plastic chairs. Posters about genetic testing and health screenings decorated the walls. The air smelled of disinfectant. Carl stiffly took a seat far from Emily, arms crossed over his chest. Noah hovered near Leah, both wearing guarded expressions. Emily sat next to Courtney, chewing on the edge of her thumb. Courtney placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder, even as her own nerves threatened to unravel. Moments later, Patrick entered with his lawyer, James Harrington, in tow. Patrick's eyes skimmed the room until they landed on Courtney and the kids. Courtney felt her pulse spike. She noticed the subtle tension in his jaw, the slight slump of his shoulders. He looked hesitant, as though uncertain whether to approach. Instead, he offered a slight nod of acknowledgement before signing in at the front desk. A lab technician in scrubs appeared, clipboard in hand. "We'll be doing simple cheek swabs and blood draws," she explained politely. "It should be quick. Each of you will come in one at a time. We'll start with the father, then the mother, then each child. The process is straightforward, nothing to be worried about." Leah raised an eyebrow at the word father, and Courtney caught the flash of annoyance that crossed her daughter's face. It reminded Courtney that, for the teens, this entire situation was a forced disruption to the life they'd known. Patrick looked over briefly, a flicker of regret in his eyes, but he said nothing. When the technician called Patrick's name, he stepped into the next room. Leah looked after him, an expression of confusion. Noah cleared his throat and stared at his sneakers. Carl scowled, silent as ever. Emily leaned against Courtney, though she seemed more curious than frightened, as if part of her wanted to see if these results might bring answers. Within a few minutes, Patrick emerged, gently rubbing the inside of his elbow. Courtney was next. She followed the technician into a small, sterile exam room. Everything about the space felt impersonal. The technician took a vial of blood and a cheek swab, labeling them carefully before handing Courtney a form. Courtney read the official statement. "I, Courtney Donovan, submit these samples for DNA testing. Results to be used in pending legal proceedings." She signed with a firm stroke, mouth set in a grim line. The moment she stepped back into the waiting room, the kids were called one by one. Emily went first, then Leah, then Noah. Each emerged quietly, their expressions solemn. Carl was last, and he returned with a hardened stare as if bracing for something he refused to name. When the tests were finished, the families were free to go. James Harrington approached Diana, presumably discussing next steps. Meanwhile, Patrick took a hesitant step toward the teens. "Hi," he ventured, voice soft. I'm sorry, this is the first time I'm seeing you up close," Carl scoffed, turning away. Leah offered a curt nod, her chin tilted in defiance. Noah managed a polite enough, "Hello." Only Emily locked eyes with Patrick, though her expression was unreadable. Courtney stepped between them before the awkward moment stretched. "We'll be leaving now," she said. "You'll get the results when we do." Patrick started to speak but closed his mouth. He simply nodded as Courtney guided the kids out the door. The chill outside was almost welcoming compared to the tension inside the lab. On the drive home, the car was silent except for the hum of the engine. Finally, Emily spoke, voice trembling. "He looked nervous." Carl scoffed again from the passenger seat. "Good, he should be." Leah turned to her brother. "We can be angry, but let's not pretend this isn't huge for us." She sounded weary, a rare admission of uncertainty. "Mom, how soon do we get the results?" Courtney tightened her grip on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road. "They said it could take up to 10 business days. After that, we'll have another court date." A subdued hush fell over them again. Each child seemed lost in private thoughts. Courtney stared straight ahead, heart pounding with the realization that their lives were on the cusp of a seismic shift. If it's confirmed, does everything change? She wondered. They all knew what the test would say, but the official confirmation would strip away any last veneer of doubt. Sure enough, just over a week later, an envelope arrived from the lab to the court, which forwarded copies to both lawyers. Diana telephoned Courtney. The result plain, a match in every sense. Patrick was conclusively the biological father. The next day, at the courthouse corridor, Courtney clutched the official printout. She glanced up to see Patrick holding the same document, his expression a tangle of relief and sorrow. When their eyes met, he murmured, "I'm sorry for everything." Courtney's throat constricted. "You've missed so much." The magnitude of it all almost broke through her composure. He nodded. "I know." Before either could say more, the bailiff called them inside. The weight of the DNA results hung between them. No longer a question, but a fact that would shape every hearing from now on. Courtney inhaled, bracing herself for what lay ahead, a contested custody battle, or a complicated process of letting a father reclaim what he had once thrown away. And as she walked into the courtroom, she felt the tension building, uncertain how long it would be before they found any semblance of peace in this storm they'd both created. The echo of the courtroom still lingered in everyone's ears as Courtney, Patrick, and their lawyers stepped out onto the wide stone steps outside Hennepin County Family Court. The DNA results had been confirmed. Patrick was undisputedly the biological father of Carl, Duo, Noah, Leah, and Emily. Although this outcome felt inevitable, the official acknowledgement caused a deep ripple across both their lives. Later that week, Judge Heather Montgomery summoned them back for a brief session where she delivered her initial directive, a supervised visitation for Patrick to meet the teenagers in a neutral location. Courtney could feel her pulse hammering as she listened to the details. Their family, which had operated under the single authority of Courtney's meticulous structure, would now have to accommodate the presence of a father no one truly knew. That first meeting was scheduled at the office of Amelia Reyes, the court-appointed social worker tasked with overseeing the reunification process. The building itself was a modest, brick structure near downtown Minneapolis, with a small plaque that read, "Hennepin Family Support Services." Inside, the reception area was quiet, save for a fish tank humming near the waiting chairs. On the day of the visit, Courtney arrived with the kids in 2 cars. She drove Carl and Noah, while Leah and Emily followed in Leah's sedan. The air felt charged with discomfort. Amelia greeted them with a bright smile. She was in her late 30s, wearing a neatly pressed blouse and carrying a clipboard tucked beneath her arm. A ring of keys jingled at her waist, hinting at the many doors she opened and closed in the course of her work. "We'll be heading into the family therapy room," she explained calmly. "It's designed to feel welcoming. There's a sofa, chairs, and a table if anyone wants to draw or write." Everyone filed inside the designated room, and almost immediately they caught sight of Patrick standing at the far end by a wide window, hands clasped behind his back. He turned at the sound of the door, the tension in his face mirrored by the teens who hesitated in the doorway. Courtney hovered protectively near Emily, her heart lurching. She fought an impulse to shield the kids, though they were nearly adults. Their shifting postures spoke volumes. Carl, broad-shouldered and stiff, looked ready to walk out at the first sign of trouble. Noah, slight but intense, was observing Patrick with reserved curiosity. Leah wore a guarded expression that revealed little, and Emily, who had the habit of translating her emotions into art, seemed overwhelmed, clutching her sketchpad tight to her side. "Welcome," Amelia began, her tone warm as she shut the door behind them. "We'll keep this first session fairly brief. Think of this as a chance to introduce yourselves and share initial thoughts, if you'd like." Patrick's eyes roamed over each teen's face, clearly searching for glimmers of familiarity. He spoke first, voice trembling with a mix of anxiety and hope. "Hi, I'm Patrick. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. I'm not here to force anything. I just want the chance to know you." Carl crossed his arms more tightly. "It's been 17 years. Feels a little late for introductions, doesn't it?" Amelia gently intervened. "Carl, it's okay to express what you feel, but let's also allow your siblings to respond." She offered a small smile. "No one is here to judge. We just want open dialogue." Emily lowered her eyes. "I wanted to see if you actually looked like us," she admitted softly. She dared a glance at Patrick. "Your eyes are really similar to mine and Noah's," she noted, then flicked her gaze to Carl. "And his." Leah cleared her throat. "I have questions about what this means going forward," she said, her tone precise. "Are you intending to share in our daily life now, or is this just some legal formality to check a box?" Patrick leaned forward, his voice steadying. "I want to be involved, but I understand it can't happen overnight. I'm prepared to follow the court's guidance, work with Mrs. Reyes, whatever it takes." Noah, who had stayed silent, finally spoke. "What do you do all day? I mean, you're a lawyer, like a corporate lawyer, or criminal lawyer, or—" He paused, letting the question hang. Amelia seized the moment. "That's an excellent way to start. Patrick, why don't you share a bit about your work, your life, so they can understand who you are now?" Over the next 20 minutes, Patrick spoke haltingly about taking over Miller and Associates after his father's passing. He described his apartment near Lake of the Isles, how he sometimes jogged by the water early in the mornings. In return, Noah and Emily offered tidbits about their own interests. Noah's fascination with engineering competitions, Emily's involvement in art club. Leah remained mostly reserved, dissecting every answer Patrick gave, while Carl's silence hovered like a storm cloud. Courtney observed it all, tight-lipped, arms folded protectively. She answered when Amelia gently asked about the kids' schedules or activities, but otherwise she let the teens take the lead. This was their encounter, after all. She refused to manage or shield them more than necessary. By the time the session ended, the atmosphere felt like a tenuous ceasefire. No one embraced, no laughter filled the room. Yet there were no outright explosions of anger either, a small accomplishment, Amelia noted. She escorted them back into the lobby, where they scheduled another supervised meeting for the following week. As Courtney ushered the teens outside, Patrick lingered momentarily in the doorway, watching them depart. The weight of regret pulled at his posture, but so did a new determination. The barriers around his children were formidable, yet not insurmountable. For the first time, he saw a possible path forward, however narrow, and vowed silently to walk it. That evening, Courtney found herself alone in the quiet living room of her home, staring absently at the framed photographs on the mantel. Each image charted the growth of her 4 children, birthday parties, school concerts, small victories no one else would remember. Moments from infancy to young adulthood were chronicled in careful snapshots, each taken during the years she had navigated alone. Her throat constricted as she recalled how she had plastered on a brave face for every celebration, determined to ensure her children never felt incomplete. Yet now, with Patrick's unexpected return, the old memories she had worked so hard to bury kept surfacing. That night, as she tidied the living room, her mind wandered back to an especially grueling period when she was 24 and newly pregnant. She had dropped out of finishing her bachelor's in business to work multiple part-time jobs, including a weekend gig at a local diner. With quadruplets on the way, medical expenses ballooned, and she scrambled to make ends meet. There had been nights she cried herself to sleep, terrified she'd failed them before they were even born. The next day, Courtney tried to function as normal. She woke early, made breakfast for the teens, and double-checked their schedules. But her composure cracked when she noticed Emily quietly skipping the meal. Emily mumbled an excuse about not feeling well, heading to her room instead. Concerned, Courtney followed, tapping gently on the door before entering. Emily was hunched at her desk, flipping through a sketchbook. Her eyes, normally so bright, were downcast. Courtney reached out, placing a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Emily looked up, emotions brimming. "I just don't know how to handle all of this," she confessed. "Meeting him. Dad, I guess. It felt so strange. Part of me was curious, but Carl's so angry, and Leah's distant, and Noah's stuck in his own head. And you, Mom, you looked so tense. I feel like I'm betraying you by even wanting to know him." Courtney's heart clenched. She gently stroked Emily's hair. "You're not betraying me," she said, voice trembling. "I've always wanted you to have a complete life, but I was scared to force a relationship with someone who walked away. I didn't trust him not to hurt you again." She swallowed, recalling the avalanche of grief she felt at the wedding that never was. "I still don't trust him, but the judge said we need to give this process a chance, so I'll do my best to support you." Emily's eyes glistened. "I need to figure out how I feel. He gave me this compliment about my art. He said I had a real gift and it made me happy. Then I felt guilty because I shouldn't be happy about anything he says, right?" She asked it with genuine confusion. Courtney knelt down beside her. "Sweetheart, your feelings are your own. It's okay to feel a mix of things. You don't have to protect me. Just be honest with yourself." That same honesty haunted Courtney long after she left Emily's room. She thought about her own fears, how she'd coped by throwing herself into meticulous routines. That evening, she drove to the quiet cemetery where her father was buried. Robert Donovan had died of a sudden heart attack when Courtney was 15, leaving a gaping hole in her life. It was her first real taste of abandonment, though unintentional. She had never truly healed from it, and Patrick's betrayal years later only compounded the trauma. Standing by her father's modest gravestone, Courtney folded her arms against a brisk wind. She whispered to the cold air, "I've been so focused on never letting anyone hurt me again, Dad. But now, I worry I'm hurting my kids by trying to shield them from him. I don't know if there's a right path anymore." The next day, she poured her heart out to Vivian, who listened with compassionate silence. At the end of Courtney's anguished monologue, Vivian offered a thoughtful suggestion: therapy. "Court," Vivian said gently, "you've carried so much alone. Even with Diana's legal guidance, you need emotional support. Maybe a counselor can help you navigate all these layers of hurt." Courtney hesitated. The idea of exposing her vulnerabilities to a therapist felt unnerving. She'd spent nearly 2 decades projecting an image of competence and control. Yet the thought also brought a flicker of relief. "I'll think about it," she conceded softly. Later that afternoon, the kids came home from school, each dispersing to their rooms. The tension hadn't vanished, but there was a subdued acceptance that their lives were in flux. Courtney found herself checking email, half expecting something from the court or from Patrick. Instead, she found a note from her own mother, Eleanor, in Florida. A typically terse message: "Heard about the situation with the father. Are you okay? Call me if you need to talk." Courtney sighed. Even thousands of miles away, her mother's quiet admonitions lingered. Midway through preparing dinner, she realized how tired she felt, tired of old pains reawakening, tired of the guilt and the anger swirling. But the memory of Emily's earnest confession steadied her. If her daughter could wrestle with conflicting emotions and still find a way forward, then perhaps Courtney could do the same. The path wouldn't be simple, but at least she was no longer denying that her old wounds still needed tending. From the outside, the Minneapolis family court building looked almost serene, its pale stone facade reflecting a crisp autumn sun. but inside the courtroom, tensions threatened to boil over. After the initial supervised visit, the case had advanced to determine what sort of custody arrangement or visitation schedule should be put in place. Now, Courtney and Patrick faced each other once again, flanked by their respective lawyers. James Harrington, Patrick's counsel, was the first to address the judge. "Your Honor, my client seeks more time with his children, unsupervised visits, leading to a regular schedule. He's proven he's both able and willing to be a father. The children are almost adults. They deserve the chance to build a relationship with him before they move on to college and beyond." On Courtney's side, Diana Wells stood, voice steady. "Your Honor, Mr. Miller may claim readiness, but we can't ignore the psychological impact of introducing him so abruptly. Ms. Donovan has spent 17 years as the sole caregiver, and the children, though curious, are wary. We request a gradual approach, starting with continued supervised sessions. We also want the involvement of an experienced counselor." Judge Montgomery, seated at her elevated bench, surveyed the room with a contemplative gaze. "I've read the social worker's preliminary report. While there is progress, there's also significant resistance from at least one of the teenagers. Ms. Reyes recommends cautious steps." She turned to Amelia, who was present for testimony. "Ms. Reyes, please share your observations." Amelia rose, smoothing her skirt. "Yes, Your Honor, Patrick Miller has demonstrated genuine effort. However, the emotional stakes are high, especially for Carl, who appears to harbor strong resentment. Leah is analytical but distant, while Noah is curious yet uncertain. Emily shows the most openness, but she's also quite sensitive. I recommend a structured approach. Visits in neutral environments, possibly including one-on-one activities that match each teen's interests. Supervision could be scaled back over time, not abruptly." As Amelia finished, the tension in the room eased a fraction. Judge Montgomery nodded, drumming her fingers on the desk. "Thank you. Based on these recommendations, the court orders a structured visitation plan. We'll start with one supervised group session per week, plus the option for Patrick to have brief, separate meetings, still supervised, tailored to each child's comfort level." Courtney exhaled, relief mingling with apprehension. This was better than handing the children over entirely without oversight. Patrick, on the other side, looked disappointed, yet resigned. With the judge's bang of the gavel, the hearing ended. Another battle concluded, though the larger war raged on. As the corridor emptied, the teens who had been excused from the main hearing joined Courtney by the vending machines, each wearing a mix of expressions. Carl looked sullen, arms thrust into his hoodie pockets. Leah fiddled with her phone, ignoring the glances from passers-by. Emily stuck close to Noah, who was absently tapping a foot against the tile floor. A few steps away, Patrick lingered, waiting for a chance to address them directly. James Harrington said something in a low voice, and Patrick nodded before stepping toward his children. Courtney watched, debating if she should intervene, but decided to let the kids handle the conversation. This was their father, after all. "Hey," Patrick said softly, looking around at the four of them. "I know this is a lot. I just want you to know I'm trying." Carl's lips tightened. "Yeah, well, maybe you should have tried 17 years ago." Before Patrick could respond, Emily broke in. "Carl, we all know it's complicated," she said, voice trembling with a frustration that was equal parts anger and sadness. "This isn't easy on any of us." Leah gave a small shrug, her gaze drifting to Patrick. "We'll be at the next supervised thing, I guess." Her words sounded more like a polite obligation than an invitation. Noah, pushing hair from his eyes, finally spoke. "I want to understand your side of the story," he said to Patrick. though he didn't sound entirely convinced he would. Maybe someday, we can talk about it. Patrick nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. Whenever you're ready. He glanced at Courtney, a silent question evident in his expression. Is there any chance we can find common ground? She looked away, focusing on Emily, who was blinking back tears. The entire exchange lasted barely a minute, and yet it seemed to weigh heavily on everyone involved. By the time Courtney ushered the kids out of the courthouse, the emotional exhaustion was palpable. In the car ride home, Carl seethed in silence while Leah scrolled through her phone. Emily stared out the window, her sketchbook unopened on her lap. Noah tapped away on a small calculator, perhaps trying to quell his nerves with logic. As Courtney pulled into their driveway, she felt as though she'd run a marathon. There would be more hearings, more decisions, more emotional upheaval. She carried the heaviness of old betrayals and newly exposed wounds, reflecting on how complicated things had become. This was more than just a legal ordeal. It was an internal struggle for everyone to reconcile a past that couldn't be undone, a present full of tension, and a future where fatherhood, long denied, was forcing itself into their carefully constructed lives. The following week, a rare, calm evening found Courtney and Patrick in a small cafe near the courthouse, summoned by their lawyers for a private negotiation. Diana Wells and James Harrington hoped a less formal setting might encourage both parties to find common ground without the strict protocols of the courtroom. The cafe was cozy, its walls lined with shelves of old books and photography prints of Minneapolis landmarks. Low-hanging pendant lights cast a warm glow over the worn wooden tables. Courtney arrived first, choosing a corner booth away from the largest crowd. She ordered a chamomile tea, hoping it would soothe her nerves. Moments later, Patrick slipped in, looking cautious. Diana and James sat across from each other, exchanging polite nods. Diana cleared her throat. We're here to discuss a possible parenting schedule that could ease tensions before the next hearing. Judge Montgomery has indicated she'd appreciate some proactive collaboration. Courtney studied Patrick's face as he settled. She could tell he was exhausted, lines of worry etching his features. In an odd flash of memory, she recalled how he used to look when they studied for law exams together, focused but anxious, determined to prove himself. It felt like a lifetime ago. James pushed a folder toward Courtney and Diana. My client proposes a structured approach similar to what Ms. Reyes suggested. Weekly, supervised visits with all 4 teens, plus the option for separate, one-on-one outings in public spaces, like a library or a cafe, if the children agree. No overnights at this stage. Courtney glanced at the typed schedule. She imagined Emily meeting Patrick at an art exhibit, Noah discussing robotics over coffee, Leah observing a mock trial with her father in a courthouse gallery. But then Carl's stony hostility came to mind. She spoke quietly. Carl wants nothing to do with this. He might outright refuse to participate. Patrick's voice tightened. I realize I've broken his trust in the worst way, but I'm prepared to wait him out. I won't force him, but I can't give up either. Diana gave Courtney a pointed look. Your children are nearly legal adults. The court can make recommendations, but it can't strong-arm them. However, if these visits go well, it might quell the potential for a custody trial that no one really wants. Courtney sighed. I'm not trying to block him. I just need to ensure the kids aren't being pushed too fast. They have finals soon, college applications. I don't want them overwhelmed. She paused, then turned to Patrick. Are you prepared to accommodate their schedules? It might mean meeting them after sports practice or on weekends. Patrick nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. My work is flexible. Marcus and the rest of the team can manage without me if I need time off. James Harrington leaned in, tapping the table. So we're all in agreement on these terms. We draft a consent agreement, keep the court updated, and see how it goes for the next few months. Diana glanced at Courtney, who closed her eyes for a moment, collecting her thoughts. "Yes," she said finally, "I can accept this plan." They hashed out details about communication, agreeing they would keep texts and calls minimal and focused on logistics. By the end of the meeting, there was a tentative outline for a visitation schedule. It was hardly a done deal. Carl, especially, might resist, but it was a start. Once Diana and James left, Courtney stayed to finish her tea. Patrick lingered, clearing his throat awkwardly. "You don't have to stay," Courtney said, not unkindly. He lifted a shoulder in a small shrug. "I wanted to ask if you have any suggestions on how to talk to Carl. I've tried sending him messages through the social worker, but he hasn't responded." Courtney wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "Carl feels betrayed. He's spent his whole life trying to be the man of the house, filling a role he thought you abandoned. He doesn't say it, but he struggles with feeling inadequate. He's angry at you, but he's also angry at himself for wanting a father at all." Patrick's gaze drifted downward. "I'm sorry," he murmured, not for the first time. "I can't fix the past, but I can be present now. I hope eventually he'll see that." They shared a silence, heavy with all that remained unsaid about their own history. The cancelled wedding, the unsent letters, the cruelty of time lost. In another life, Courtney might have reached across the table to hold his hand, but now everything between them felt guarded, shaped by broken promises and years of distance. She finished her tea, leaving only the swirling patterns of leaves in the cup's bottom. Finally, she gathered her purse. "Good night, Patrick," she said softly. He offered a small nod in return, and she exited into the crisp Minneapolis evening. Though they had drafted a fragile agreement, Courtney knew that forging real connections would require more than signatures on paper. It demanded trust, which was in short supply, for her, for Carl, and maybe even for Patrick himself. A brisk Saturday afternoon found Patrick waiting at a local park, hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. There was a slight drizzle in the air, and the grey sky reflected a sense of tentative expectation. Today would be the first time he attempted to spend individual time with each teen, under Amelia's supervision, but outside of her cramped office. The arrangement was that each child could opt in, or not, and they'd meet at different intervals. His heart jumped a little when he spotted Leah approaching in the distance. She wore a warm coat and clutched a small notebook. Amelia walked beside her, carrying an umbrella. Patrick noted that Leah looked somewhat like Courtney had at that age, poised, eyes sharp with intelligence. He tried to calm his nerves as they closed the distance. Leah offered a polite greeting, her tone formal. Amelia gestured to a nearby bench beneath a large oak tree, where they could sit while she maintained a discreet distance, ready to intervene if tension rose. Patrick cleared his throat. "Thank you for meeting me," he said gently. Leah shrugged. "Ms. Reyes said it might be helpful if we talked. I figured I'd give it a try. I have questions." He nodded, exhaling. "Ask me anything." She opened her notebook. "We know you left Mom on the wedding day. But why? Mom never gave us the details. Just that you weren't ready. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Patrick ran a hand over his jaw, wincing. "It's painful to recount, but you deserve honesty. I was young, terrified. My father's demands were immense. He wanted me to be this perfect lawyer, a pillar of society, and I was paralyzed by the idea of taking on a family I wasn't sure I could provide for. Instead of facing my fears, I ran. It's the single worst mistake of my life." Leah bit her lip. "Did you know about us? Mom said she tried contacting your family. Did you get any messages?" His shoulders slumped. I was in Chicago by then. If she called, I never got the message. I suspect my father might have intercepted attempts to reach me. He was controlling and believed Courtney was trapping me, which wasn't true. But I bear responsibility. I was too cowardly to call and find out what happened, and I lived with that guilt for years. Leah studied him for a long moment, flipping a page in her notebook. So now you expect us to just let you in? No, he replied quietly. I'm not expecting acceptance overnight. I'm hoping we can build something new, even if it's just trust, piece by piece. He paused. I also heard you might want to study law. Is that true? She raised her eyebrows, a flicker of interest crossing her face. I'm applying to pre-law programs. I like analyzing cases, finding logical solutions. It feels like a way to uphold fairness. Patrick managed a small smile. I'd be happy to share what I know about the field, or put you in touch with colleagues who can mentor you. He hesitated. Only if you want? Leah glanced at him, torn. Maybe, she said finally, scribbling a note. They spent the next half hour discussing law school admissions, the types of internships available, even referencing a few famous legal cases. By the end, the tension had softened. Amelia approached, smiling gently. Seems like progress, she observed. Leah closed her notebook. Thank you for the advice, she said, and without further sentiment, headed back toward the parking lot. Not long after, Noah ambled over, hands tucked into the pockets of a hoodie featuring a science club logo. I guess it's my turn, he said in a neutral tone. Patrick stood, offering a handshake, which Noah accepted awkwardly. They meandered to another section of the park, where a small pond reflected the muted sky. Noah's questions revolved around Patrick's law practice, not from a legal standpoint like Leah, but from a place of pure curiosity about strategy, problem-solving, and how arguments were structured. Debate club is my favorite. It's kind of like science, hypotheses, evidence, conclusions. Patrick matched Noah's measured tone. I was on the debate team in college, loved constructing arguments, anticipating rebuttals. It's logical. You'd excel at it. A hint of pride flickered in Noah's eyes. Maybe, he said, sounding unconvinced, but it's weird hearing that from you. I mean, you're basically a stranger. Patrick nodded soberly. I understand. Stranger or not, I do see your potential. They spoke a bit longer, the conversation peppered with short silences. Eventually, Noah shuffled off with Amelia, leaving Patrick to reflect on the subtle connections forming. They were tenuous, but real. Carl never showed. Patrick tried to tamp down his disappointment, but it gnawed at him. Amelia confirmed that Carl had outright refused, saying he'd have nothing to say to that man. Finally, Emily arrived. She wore a paint-splattered sweatshirt, clutching a sketch pad under one arm. Unlike her siblings, she offered a tentative smile. Hey, she said, voice soft. They sat on a park bench, and Emily opened her sketchbook, flipping through half-finished drawings. I paint to process emotions, she explained, showing him abstract shapes swirling with color. One page caught his eye, a rough outline of 4 silhouettes, arms linked. Another figure stood alone off to the side, shadowed. Patrick swallowed. Is that me? She nodded slowly. I started it after the first supervised visit. I'm not sure how to draw you into the picture yet. His throat tightened. I hope one day you can, he said quietly. Emily's eyes glistened. I think I'd like to. It's just not easy. She glanced away, flipping to a blank page, then shot him a shy look. Would it be weird if I sketched you right now? Emotions threatened to choke him, but he kept his voice steady. I'd be honored. She opened her art pencil box, and he watched as her hand moved deftly, capturing subtle angles of his face, lines of regret in his forehead, the tired sincerity in his eyes. They stayed like that for nearly half an hour, exchanging soft words about her art classes, his regrets, and the sense that despite the tension, There might be a shared thread of creativity binding them. When Amelia signaled the end of the session, Patrick stood, gazing at Emily's emerging sketch. She closed her book, tucking it under her arm as she offered a small, genuine smile. "Thanks for letting me do that," she murmured. He nodded. "Any time," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Watching Emily walk back toward Amelia, Patrick felt both relief and heartbreak. 3 of his children had taken tentative steps toward him, but Carl's absence burned like a wound unaddressed. Still, the day ended with cautious optimism. For the first time, he felt the threads of a tapestry slowly knitting together, a fragile new family dynamic that might, against all odds, hold. The storm had been building for months, but the day it finally broke felt eerily calm. Courtney arrived at the courthouse with Diana Wells, noticing how the early morning sky hung grey and heavy, threatening rain. Already, the main hall was crowded with attorneys flipping through case files, families seated on cold benches, and the low hum of whispered conversations filling the air. This was the final hearing for determining a formal custody and visitation order, a vital step after months of supervised meetings, tentative one-on-one outings, and a swirl of conflicting emotions among the teenagers. Courtney's nerves were rattled. She'd barely slept the night before, replaying every interaction Patrick had shared with the kids. She didn't know which version of events James Harrington, Patrick's lawyer, would present in court. Would he push aggressively for immediate shared custody? As they approached the assigned courtroom, Courtney spotted Margaret Miller quietly pacing in a corner, her posture tense. Nearby stood Patrick, conferring with Harrington. Something about the set of Patrick's shoulders told Courtney he was uneasy too. She tried not to let the old pang of empathy distract her. "Focus," she reminded herself. Inside, the walls were a dull beige, lined with stacks of manila folders on the clerk's table. Judge Heather Montgomery soon took her seat, scanning through her notes. This would be no simple session. Everyone sensed the stakes were higher than ever. Harrington rose to speak first. "Your Honor, we're here to finalize a custody arrangement. Mr. Miller has demonstrated consistent commitment. He's been punctual to all supervised visits and has begun forging meaningful connections with 3 of the 4 teenagers, albeit with some resistance from Carl. We request that the court grant shared legal custody and unsupervised visitation rights. My client is prepared to work around the children's schedules and adapt as needed." Courtney felt her pulse spike at the words, "shared legal custody." She braced herself as Diana Wells stood. "Ms. Donovan acknowledges Mr. Miller's recent efforts. However, we must address the years of absence and the ongoing emotional strain on the teens. While 3 of them show gradual acceptance, Carl's hostility is evident. A sudden transition to unsupervised visits could destabilize the fragile progress they've made. We propose a structured, incremental plan with the possibility of shared custody in the future if Patrick continues showing consistency." The judge eyed both sides. "Thank you, counselors. I've also received an updated report from Amelia Reyes, who has overseen much of the supervised contact. Ms. Reyes, please present your findings." Amelia stepped forward with her clipboard. She cleared her throat, then spoke in a measured tone. "Overall, Mr. Miller has been cooperative. Noah, Leah, and Emily exhibit cautious optimism, though all 3 express varying degrees of emotional conflict. Emily, the most open, has begun to develop a genuine bond with Mr. Miller through shared creative interests. Leah appreciates his legal expertise and guidance, but remains guarded. Noah values his father's logical approach and willingness to discuss debate-related topics." The judge glanced at Courtney. "And Carl?" Amelia took a careful breath. "Carl is unwilling to engage. He's consistently declined individual visits. In the group sessions, he's present but distant, often leaving early or refusing to speak. He shows signs of anger and perhaps unresolved grief for the father figure he never had. In my professional opinion, forcing Carl into unsupervised interactions against his will could exacerbate his resentment. A hush settled over the room. Patrick looked visibly pained. He opened his mouth, as though wanting to speak up, but Harrington placed a hand on his arm, a reminder to let the process continue. Judge Montgomery turned pages in her file, frowning in concentration. Mr. Miller, Ms. Donovan, and counsel, I must consider the best interest of all 4 children, including Carl. Yet the other 3 deserve the chance to explore a relationship with their father at a deeper level, if they choose. She tapped her pen against the desk. At the same time, I'm not comfortable granting full shared custody overnight. The children's emotional well-being is at stake. Courtney released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She could sense Patrick's frustration from across the aisle. The judge continued, I propose the following. Partial legal custody remains with Ms. Donovan for the next 6 months, with expanded visitation rights for Mr. Miller, still following a structured timetable. Noah, Leah, and Emily may meet him unsupervised if they consent. Carl will not be forced into unsupervised visits, but he is encouraged to seek counseling. An undercurrent of tension rippled through the courtroom. Harrington prepared to object, but the judge held up a hand. We'll reconvene in 6 months to reassess. If Mr. Miller continues to demonstrate consistent involvement, and if the children show readiness, we can revisit shared legal custody. Until then, we maintain a cautious but progressive approach. With a firm bang of the gavel, the hearing ended. Courtney felt equal parts relief and apprehension. It wasn't a complete victory for either side. She left the courtroom, collecting the teenagers in the hallway. Emily looked slightly relieved. Leah wore her characteristic thoughtful expression. Noah nodded in quiet acceptance. Carl, however, glowered, arms folded defiantly. As for Patrick, he appeared torn, disappointed at not achieving full custody yet, but perhaps relieved that he wouldn't be cut off from the 3 who wanted a connection. Standing near the exit, he seemed to contemplate approaching Courtney and the kids, but instead he caught her eye, gave a small nod, and turned away with Harrington. Outside, rain had begun to fall. Courtney pulled her jacket closer, the teens clustering around her. She wondered how much more turmoil each of them could bear before they found lasting peace. If the heavy clouds overhead were any indication, the storm that began here might not end anytime soon. In the days following the court's decision, a tense hush settled over the Donovan household. Courtney and the children were navigating their own emotional minefields, unsure of how to balance everyday routines with the looming new schedule of visits. Every time the phone rang, Courtney felt a jolt of anxiety, anticipating that it might be Patrick with a last-minute plan or a conflict that needed resolving. One evening, after a silent family dinner, Carl stalked off to his room. Courtney debated following him, but decided to give him space. She found Emily in the living room, flipping through channels without really watching anything. Leah and Noah had retreated to their shared study corner, whispering about upcoming exams. The house was too quiet, a stark contrast to the typical bustle she'd spent years managing as a single mother. The next day, she discovered Carl missing. He hadn't come down for breakfast, and she assumed he'd left early for basketball practice. But soon she saw his gym bag lying by the front door. Panic cinched her chest. She phoned the school. The receptionist confirmed Carl wasn't there. Fear gripped Courtney as she dialed his cell. It went straight to voicemail. She called Vivian, voice shaking. I can't find Carl. He's not answering, and he isn't at school. I don't know where else to check. Vivian tried to sound reassuring. Maybe he just needed space. He's nearly 18. Maybe he took a drive or walked somewhere to cool off. Courtney's voice trembled. He's never done this. He's always told me if he was leaving. This is unlike him. Hours dragged by. Courtney and Vivian drove around familiar neighborhoods, searching local parks, the basketball court where Carl usually played, even the diner downtown where he sometimes ate with friends. No sign of him. Each empty street fueled Courtney's mounting dread. By late afternoon, she was ready to call the police when a text finally arrived on her phone. "I'm fine. Don't worry." It was from Carl's number. No further explanation. Relief mingled with anger. Courtney keyed in a reply, "Where are you?" but got no response. A few more agonizing hours passed before she received another text from him. "Meet me at the old park." Courtney's heart pounded. She knew exactly which park he meant, the small one near the church where her ill-fated wedding day began so many years ago. It was also the place she and Patrick used to walk in the evenings during their brief, happier times. Nightfall was near when Courtney arrived. She found Carl sitting on a weathered wooden bench, hoodie pulled up, staring at the overgrown grass near the playground. As she approached, her anger flickered, but the sight of his slumped shoulders replaced it with concern. "Carl, you had me worried sick," she murmured, keeping her voice gentle. She sat down beside him, leaving a slight gap between them. He didn't immediately reply, just stared at a rusted swing set. Finally, he spoke in a low monotone. "I just needed to get away. Mom, everything's messed up. Patrick tries to act like he can just make things better, but he doesn't know me. You've always done everything, and now I'm not even sure if that's enough anymore. I feel angry all the time." Her throat tightened. "I know you're hurting. I won't pretend to understand the extent of it, but I'm here." Carl gritted his teeth. "You two are fighting a war in court over us. Everyone says it's about what's best for the kids, but I feel like some prize you both want to claim or push away. It's suffocating." Courtney's eyes misted over. "I never meant to make you feel like a pawn. I just spent years shielding you from disappointment, and now I'm lost, too." He turned to face her. In the dim light of the street lamp, she saw tears in his eyes, something he rarely revealed. "Then why does it feel like I can't breathe? Every day, the lawyers talk about my future. Patrick wants me to call him Dad. You want me to keep my guard up. My siblings keep telling me to give him a chance. But what if I don't want to?" Courtney reached out, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder. "You have a right to your feelings. The judge can make rules, but she can't force your heart to change." A long pause followed. Then Carl exhaled, as though releasing some of the tension built up inside him. "I didn't know where else to go," he admitted softly. "I just remembered you once told me this park meant something, a place where you realized the life you thought you'd have was gone. I guess I sort of feel the same right now." Courtney's tears slipped free. She hugged him, careful not to push too far if he resisted, but he let her, resting his chin against her shoulder. They stayed like that for a moment, mother and son sharing a raw, painful truth. This situation had no perfect solutions. Eventually, Carl pulled away. "I'm sorry I made you worry." He rose from the bench, looking around. "Let's go home." They walked toward the car in silence, the damp air wrapping them in a quiet understanding. The war wasn't over. There would be more battles, more heated court sessions, more heartbreak, but in that moment, the cost of it all felt real in a way no legal motion could capture. Courtney realized the true damage wasn't about winning or losing. It was the toll it exacted on the people she loved most. 2 weeks after Carl's brief disappearance, the court-ordered therapy sessions began. Judge Montgomery had recommended a specialized family counselor, Dr. Rachel Stevens, who had years of experience helping estranged parents reintegrate. Courtney felt skeptical at first, but she went along with the plan, hoping it might soften Carl's bitterness and guide the other teenagers' tangled feelings. The therapy office was located in a refurbished brownstone near the Minneapolis Arts District, its waiting room decorated with bright abstract paintings. The first session was an emotional minefield, with all four teens, Courtney and Patrick, in a circle of chairs while Dr. Stevens observed quietly, letting them find their own way to speak. Emily was first to break the silence. "I want this to work," she confessed, eyes flicking between Courtney and Patrick. "I like it when he takes me to art exhibits. It feels good to have someone who notices my sketches and praises them. But I know that makes Mom uncomfortable. And Carl, you hate it." Carl, scowling, opened his mouth as if to retort but hesitated. Instead, he folded his arms and stared at the floor, resentment radiating from his posture. Noah took a breath. "I'm okay talking to Patrick about academic stuff, but every time we get close to anything personal, I shut down. It feels like I'm betraying Mom, even though she says I'm not. It's all so confusing." Leah chimed in, voice steady. "I want to see the logic in this situation, but it's not a math problem I can solve with neat formulas. I know Patrick regrets leaving. I know Mom's anger is valid. But how do we move forward? I don't want to spend my last year of high school feeling like I have to choose a side." Courtney felt a pang at that. She glanced at Patrick, who looked stricken by the kid's confessions. "This is good," she told herself. "They're finally letting it out." She inhaled, deciding she, too, needed to speak. "It's true that I've felt uneasy about you bonding with Patrick," she admitted. "After he left me at the altar, I spent years trying to protect myself and all of you from more disappointment. But now, I'm discovering that my protective instinct might be hurting you in a different way, limiting your experiences." The honesty in her words seemed to cut through the tension. Dr. Stevens nodded, encouraging Patrick to respond. He looked around the circle, clearly grappling with conflicting emotions. "I've never been more ashamed of anything than how I abandoned you and your mother. I can't undo that, but I can be here now, whether that's to help Leah with legal studies, talk science with Noah, watch Emily's art progress, or, I don't know, play basketball with Carl, if he ever wants that." Carl's gaze flicked up momentarily, but he said nothing, jaw clenched. The group fell into a brittle silence, which Dr. Stevens eventually broke. She explained the concept of rebuilding a broken house. They had to clear away debris before constructing a new foundation. "Each of you has legitimate pain, fear, or guilt," she said. "Acknowledging that is the first step toward healing." In subsequent sessions, the family members worked in smaller clusters. Patrick and Carl tried a one-on-one therapy meeting, though it ended with Carl storming out when confronted about his lingering anger. Leah confided to Dr. Stevens that she feared letting Patrick into her life would undermine her loyalty to Courtney. Noah confessed that he'd researched Patrick online years ago, even found a mailing address in Chicago, but never had the courage to contact him. Emily delved deeper into the artwork she'd created, capturing her father's return as a swirl of dark and bright colors, symbolizing both pain and hope. While progress was gradual and uneasy, Courtney noticed small shifts. Carl stopped leaving the house in a fury whenever Patrick's name came up. Leah asked her father a question or two about law school deadlines. Noah texted Patrick a science article link at midnight, a sign he was starting to trust him at least in small intellectual exchanges. Emily continued to flourish artistically, showing Patrick new sketches. Through these sessions, Courtney faced her own buried insecurities. She recognized the parallels between Patrick's abandonment and losing her own father at a young age. In therapy, she finally admitted how her coping mechanism had been total self-reliance, shutting everyone out. "I thought if I never depended on anyone again, I'd never be hurt again," she said, voice trembling. "But that only built a wall between me and the people I love, my own children included." Patrick had tears in his eyes, but he didn't speak. "Doctor." Stevens guided Courtney through acknowledging that some walls needed to be lowered, carefully, if genuine reconciliation was to happen. Week by week, the family constructed new scaffolding where once there had been only ruins. Despite the occasional blow-up, particularly from Carl, Courtney sensed that the reconstruction the therapist mentioned wasn't just a hopeful metaphor. Something real was forming, a precarious unity that might, with time, become genuine. At the end of one particularly difficult session, Dr. Stevens offered a gentle smile. "You're all carrying scars that run deep, but scars can be a reminder of healing, not just wounding." Standing together in that office, Courtney felt the weight of the past shifting. Perhaps they were beginning to learn how to live with it rather than be defined by it. A full year had almost passed since Patrick's return to Minneapolis, and the once unimaginable was happening. A workable rhythm began to settle in. The partial custody arrangement, combined with therapy sessions, had laid the groundwork for a cautious but steady evolution in everyone's relationships. Noah, for instance, started meeting Patrick every other weekend at the local science museum. They found mutual fascination in exhibits about engineering, robotics, and quantum theory. Courtney noticed how her son would come home energized, brandishing pamphlets and excitedly rattling off facts about new discoveries. Their conversations over the dinner table often began with, "Dad said," a phrase that still caught Courtney off guard, but she tried not to let her discomfort show. Leah, more guarded, agreed to join Patrick at a mock trial program for high school students. He introduced her to colleagues who specialized in family law, and she soaked up their advice about college courses, internship opportunities, and the realities of legal practice. Each time she returned from these outings, her enthusiasm was palpable, even if she tried to play it cool. When Courtney asked how things went, Leah would shrug and say, "It was decent," but her eyes sparkled with ambition. Emily blossomed in her artistic pursuits. She'd been accepted into a competitive art workshop, something Courtney initially worried might disrupt Emily's academic focus, but Patrick advocated for her, showing Courtney articles about successful artists who balanced creative studies with future career prospects. The turning point came when Emily proudly revealed a scholarship offer from a local art institute. Courtney realized that maybe, just maybe, letting go of her rigid expectations could be worthwhile. Emily's happiness was undeniable. Carl, on the other hand, remained the missing piece in Patrick's newly forming puzzle. He still refused direct contact outside therapy, and even in therapy, he mostly seethed in silence. But one evening, as Courtney parked her car in the driveway, she noticed a second vehicle, a dark sedan she recognized as Patrick's, pulling away from the curb. Carl stood by the mailbox, arms folded. She quickly got out, heart pounding. "What was Patrick doing here?" she asked cautiously. Carl shrugged, pretending indifference. He dropped something off, some letter from his law firm about an internship program. "Said he thought I might be interested in paralegal training." He paused, scuffing a shoe on the sidewalk. "I told him I'm not interested in law, but I guess he's trying." Courtney didn't push further. She sensed that small exchange was more significant than Carl would admit. For him to have stood there and not stormed away might be the closest he'd come to acknowledging Patrick's overtures. Meanwhile, Courtney's own life began to take new turns. With the kids nearing graduation age, she found herself thinking about expanding precision accounts beyond her core clientele. She hired 2 new employees and considered taking a business loan to upgrade her office space. The thought both thrilled and scared her. She'd been comfortable in her small but stable niche for years, yet something in her was shifting, an urge to grow, to embrace change rather than fear it. It was during one of these reflective moments that Margaret Miller reached out, inviting Courtney to tea. Courtney hesitated. Her relationship with Patrick's mother had always been distant, laced with old resentments, but curiosity nudged her to accept. Meeting in Margaret's cozy living room, Courtney noticed how carefully she'd arranged pastries and set out fine china cups. It reminded Courtney that Margaret had her own share of heartbreak, losing her husband, witnessing her son's mistakes. They spoke tentatively at first, discussing the weather and holiday plans. Then Margaret gently placed a hand over Courtney's. "I've wanted to apologize for so long," Margaret said, eyes earnest. "William was a formidable man. He believed he was protecting Patrick from a life he thought he wasn't ready for. I should have intervened, told Patrick the truth if I knew about your pregnancy. I regret not doing more." Courtney swallowed hard. "I appreciate you saying that. It's been lonely, raising them alone. But I don't regret my children. They're incredible." A small tear rolled down Margaret's cheek. "I know. I see them now. And they're bright, strong, each unique. I only wish William had lived long enough to see how wrong he was to keep Patrick in the dark. Perhaps we'd be in a different place today." Courtney found her voice trembling. "It's not too late to build something with them. They're your grandchildren." Margaret nodded. "I hope so. Emily sent me a sketch she did. It's hanging in my hallway. Noah emails me the silliest science jokes sometimes. Leah actually asked me to proofread one of her debate essays. I'm grateful. But Carl," she sighed. "I know he's the toughest one." Courtney looked away, recalling how stubborn Carl could be, how his resentment for Patrick ran deeper than the others. "He may come around or he may not," she said, forcing a sad smile. "All we can do is keep the door open." After leaving Margaret's house, Courtney felt an unexpected sense of release. Where once she'd been weighed down by grudges and fears, she now carried a cautious acceptance of the new paths forming in their lives. The old narratives were changing, maybe even healing, though not without hurdles. She stepped into her car, realizing that the expansions happening at Precision Accounts mirrored the expansions happening in her family. Growth was risky, unpredictable, but possibly rewarding. That evening, she found an email from Patrick. It was short, stating that he'd like to discuss a possible college fund contribution for Emily's art program if Courtney would allow it. She would have bristled, seeing his involvement as an intrusion. Now she stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a measured response. "Thank you for offering. Let's talk about it together, maybe with Emily present." She hit send, heart fluttering. A year ago, she could never have imagined such a civil, collaborative exchange. Closing her laptop, she realized that forging new paths was never simple, but at least they weren't walking them alone anymore. Spring finally arrived in Minneapolis, bringing a welcome warmth that seemed to reflect the shifting atmosphere in Courtney's family. The big day was fast approaching, the quadruplet's 18th birthday. In past years, Courtney had always planned modest family gatherings, just the kids, maybe Vivian and a couple of close friends. But this year felt different, charged with the need to mark the end of childhood and the delicate progress made since Patrick re-entered their lives. Planning the celebration posed questions. Should Patrick be invited? Should they combine celebrations? Emily, Leah, Noah, and Carl hesitated, each grappling with different feelings about their father's involvement. Eventually, to everyone's surprise, Carl was the one who spoke up. "If we're doing it, then let's do it together," he muttered. "No point in having two separate parties if we're supposed to be a family, right?" Courtney hid her astonishment. Carl's words, though spoken in a gruff tone, hinted at a willingness to share this milestone. Emily beamed, Leah nodded thoughtfully, and Noah gave a small grin. So, a joint birthday celebration was set on the lawn of Courtney's house, with Patrick invited, plus Margaret, Eleanor, Courtney's mother, visiting from Florida, and a handful of the teens' closest friends. The morning of the party dawned bright and clear. Courtney had strung up decorations across the backyard, balloons, banners, and a long buffet table laden with snacks, a sheet cake, and homemade lemonade. Vivian arrived first, carrying trays of food. Patrick showed up soon after, carefully balancing boxes of gifts. He paused near his car, scanning the yard. Courtney took a deep breath and walked over to greet him. "Hi," she said, keeping her voice even. "Glad you could make it on time." He gave a small chuckle. "I promised Leah I'd help set up. She emailed me a list of tasks." He held up the piece of paper, lines of neat bullet points describing exactly what needed to be done. Courtney shook her head in amusement. The atmosphere was strangely companionable as they worked together, tying extra balloons and positioning chairs. By noon, people began trickling in. Margaret Miller arrived, hugging each grandchild in turn. Eleanor Donovan stepped in with a more cautious demeanor, but soon found herself in conversation with Margaret about garden tips. The two older women, who had once been so tense with each other, bonded over sharing stories of their grown children's failings and triumphs. Meanwhile, the backyard buzzed with teenage chatter. Friends teased Carl about his new roles on the basketball team, while Leah proudly mentioned an upcoming debate competition. Emily's friends huddled around her sketchbook, admiring her latest designs, and Noah discussed an engineering project with anyone who would listen. Patrick stood near the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs, occasionally nodding to passers-by. About halfway through the party, Courtney gathered everyone around for the traditional singing of Happy Birthday. 4 separate cakes had once been the family tradition, one for each child's unique tastes. But this time, they'd agreed on a single large cake with 4 sets of decorative toppers. After the song ended, the teens each blew out a corner of the cake, laughter erupting as they nearly collided heads. Then came the gift-giving. Margaret stepped forward first, handing Carl a small wrapped box. "This belonged to William," she explained gently. Carl unwrapped it to reveal a classic wristwatch with initials engraved inside. He pursed his lips, blinking away emotion. "Thanks," he mumbled, slipping it onto his wrist. Patrick's turn followed. He approached the siblings with a large bag. One by one, he distributed gifts carefully chosen to resonate with each child's passion. For Noah, a second-hand but sophisticated telescope, perfect for late-night stargazing or science experiments. For Leah, a vintage legal tome, the Federalist Papers in a collector's edition, along with a handwritten note about never underestimating the power of informed debate. For Emily, a set of top-quality paintbrushes and a voucher for an art supply store. He also showed her a letter of recommendation he'd helped secure from a local gallery owner for a summer internship. Emily's eyes lit up. For Carl, a basketball signed by a local college star, along with a membership to a sports mentorship program. Carl stared at it for a moment, then gave a curt nod. Not exactly a hug, but something akin to acceptance. Courtney watched the scene unfold, her throat tight with emotion. The kids had grown so fast, and for years she was the only adult figure in their world. Now, watching them interact with Patrick, she felt a flurry of conflicting feelings: pride, sadness, relief. Each child was forging a cautious relationship with him, shaped by pain but also hope. As the evening glow settled over the party, a surprising warmth swept the yard. Patrick and Courtney found themselves at the buffet table, replenishing snacks. Emily caught sight of them and called, "Hey, Mom! Dad, come take a picture with us." The words "mom" and "dad" in the same sentence stole Courtney's breath for a moment. She glanced at Patrick, who looked equally stunned, but smiled. Standing together for a group photo, Courtney, Patrick, and the 4 teenagers posed under a banner reading "Happy 18th." Friends and relatives cheered, cameras flashed. The moment felt both unreal and deeply genuine, like a family at last, even if imperfectly formed. Afterward, as the sun dipped behind the house, Patrick made a quiet comment to Courtney. "Thank you for letting me be part of this." She gave a small nod, emotion tightening her chest. "We're all still figuring things out," she said softly. "But I guess this is a start." They didn't hug or exchange grand confessions. But as they turned to rejoin the others, Courtney felt something loosen in her heart, a knot that had been wound tight for 18 years. The past was still there, with all its scars, but for the first time, the present felt undeniably promising. The sweet ache of it brought tears to her eyes, and, strangely, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were all on the cusp of a new beginning. A light drizzle tapped against the roof of Courtney's suburban Minneapolis home as she prepared the weekly family dinner. It had become a new tradition. Every Sunday evening, Patrick joined them for a meal, carefully navigating the boundaries that still hovered between them. Courtney stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, aware of how surreal it sometimes felt to have Patrick's presence integrated, albeit cautiously, into their daily life. In the dining room, Noah and Leah were laying out plates and cutlery, discussing an upcoming college fair. Emily was perched on a bar stool, fiddling with her phone. Carl was in the backyard, bouncing a basketball idly under the overcast sky. Even though he refused to admit it, he was gradually making peace with Patrick's role, if only for the sake of the family dynamic. By the time Patrick arrived, the stew was bubbling with savory warmth. He let himself in quietly, calling a soft hello as he stepped into the foyer. Courtney tensed for an instant at the sound of his voice echoing through the house, then forced herself to relax. She didn't want to be on edge all the time. In the months following the quad's 18th birthday, the tension had lessened, but old patterns didn't vanish overnight. "Hey," Patrick said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. He set down a paper bag filled with fresh bread from a local bakery. He looked around for a moment, as though taking stock of how comfortable or uneasy everyone was. Then he offered Courtney a measured smile. "I brought sourdough. Thought it might go well with the stew." "Great," she replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Could you slice it, please?" He nodded, rolling up his sleeves. Leah and Noah hovered near the table, occasionally glancing over to see if he needed help. Emily joined them, leaning against a counter, while Carl lingered outside, still bouncing the basketball. Thump, 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 against the ground. Once the meal was ready, Courtney called everyone to the table. Carl ambled in last, setting his basketball near the back door. They all took seats. For a while, the only sounds were utensils clinking on plates and quiet sipping of water. Yet there was nothing overtly hostile. It was more like a tentative calm, a day-to-day routine that was still finding its footing. Leah, always the direct one, launched into a conversation about college decisions. "The application deadlines are coming up. I'm trying to finalize my personal statement." She glanced meaningfully at Patrick. "I appreciate the insights you gave me last week, by the way, about law undergrad programs." Patrick seemed genuinely pleased. "You're welcome. Let me know if you want me to review anything else. I have colleagues who can offer extra advice on letters of recommendation, too." Leah nodded, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Meanwhile, Noah brought up a campus visit planned for next month. Emily confessed she was still struggling between attending a traditional university for a general arts degree or diving straight into a specialized art institute. Courtney listened carefully, stirring her spoon around her bowl. She was proud of how far they'd come. Just a year ago, Patrick's name was barely allowed in the house, and now he was actively advising them about their futures. The conversation eventually turned to finances. Emily mentioned that tuition at the Art Institute was steep. Patrick inhaled, setting down his spoon. "I'd like to help cover some of your tuition. Actually, for all of you. I know money doesn't erase the years I was gone, but I want to contribute if you'll let me." Carl stiffened, gaze flicking to Courtney. Her chest tightened, but she remembered how they'd discussed this possibility in therapy. "Don't let pride stand in the way if the kids benefit, Dr. Stevens had cautioned. Exhaling, Courtney mustered a steady tone. "I'm open to discussing it. We just need to figure out the details." Carl leaned back, crossing his arms. "I don't need any handouts," he muttered. His eyes, however, revealed a tangled blend of resentment and yearning. He still wrestled with the part of him that wanted a father's support. Noah cleared his throat softly. "Carl, it's not a handout. He's our dad." The word dad hung in the air. Even after months, it still felt charged. For a moment, the room went still, everyone bracing for Carl's reaction. But instead of snapping back, Carl merely looked down at his untouched bread and shrugged. It was a subtle sign that he was tired of fighting every single moment. Patrick kept his voice calm. "Whatever you decide, I'm here to help. No pressure." They finished dinner in a tenuous truce. After the dishes were cleared, Courtney and Patrick found themselves alone in the kitchen, rinsing plates. She focused on the warm water running over her hands, the faint fragrance of dish soap. "Thank you for offering to help with their tuition," she said quietly, not looking at him. He paused before responding. "I want to do more, but I'll follow your lead. I know trust is earned, not demanded." She glanced at him, meeting his gaze for a moment. The kitchen lights cast a gentle glow on his face, revealing lines of regret mixed with resolution. "I appreciate that," she replied, her tone softer than it had been in a long time. Neither of them spoke further on the subject. The silence was comfortable enough to feel like progress. Later that night, Courtney found herself alone in her bedroom, reflecting on how much had changed and how much still remained uncertain. Tomorrow, she'd meet with her accountant about expanding her business, a plan she'd put on hold for months because of the ongoing family drama. She realized she was both nervous and excited. Maybe, she thought, I'm finally ready to move forward too. Outside, the rain had stopped. A gentle wind brushed the trees, hinting at the warmer days ahead. There was no grand reconciliation between her and Patrick, nor any easy fix for the pain that lingered. But the family was at least inching towards stability, forging a routine that might, in time, become normal. Courtney felt a cautious sense of hope, not a fairy tale hope, but the kind rooted in hard-won steps, and for now, that felt enough. One by one, the quadruplets began to finalize their college plans. Acceptance letters trickled in, followed by financial aid packages, scholarship awards, and inevitably emotional goodbyes looming on the horizon. Courtney often found herself wandering the now quiet house, imagining the rooms emptied of the noise she'd grown so used to over the last 18 years. The day Leah officially chose to attend a prestigious pre-law program in Ohio, Courtney felt a rush of pride tinged with sorrow. Leah, ever the planner, laid out a 3-year blueprint for her studies, complete with internships, moot court competitions, and a roadmap to law school. Patrick's chest swelled with admiration when she showed him, though he refrained from overt congratulations, respecting Leah's measured sense of independence. Noah, always methodical, decided on an engineering program at a top university in Massachusetts. His acceptance letter had arrived with a partial scholarship. One evening, Courtney found him in his room, packing up some of his science fair trophies and notebooks months in advance. "I'm just getting a head start," he said with a shy grin. Yet she saw the tear in his eye when he realized how real it was becoming. Emily pursued her passion at a local art institute, which was both a relief and a challenge for Courtney. It meant Emily would still be in Minneapolis, but in a new environment that demanded artistic growth and came with no small expense. True to his word, Patrick quietly financed a significant portion of her tuition, though Emily insisted on applying for grants and scholarships herself. The mother-daughter tension over practical careers had eased, leaving behind a sense of mutual respect for Emily's talent. Carl, however, remained the wild card. While he had decent grades, the college route didn't seem to spark him. Instead, he confided in Courtney late one night after basketball practice that he was considering going straight into the workforce or possibly a sports training program. "I don't know, Mom. Everyone's pushing college, but I'm not sure it's for me," he admitted, the vulnerability evident in his eyes. Courtney found herself torn, recalling the years she'd pinned her hopes on each child's academic future. Yet she also recognized the damage that pushing too hard could do. "Maybe take a gap year," she suggested gently. "You can keep your options open, Carl, or see if you can find a part-time job and a part-time training program. It doesn't have to be all or nothing." In the midst of these transitions, Patrick wrestled with his own set of conflicting feelings. Watching the kids pack up for adulthood reminded him of all he'd missed. First steps, bedtime stories, birthdays. Though he'd stepped into their lives late, he discovered that letting them go came with its own ache. More than once, Courtney observed him outside the house, leaning against his car after dropping off one of the teens, staring at the driveway as though unwilling to drive away. One warm afternoon, Courtney returned from grocery shopping to find Patrick sitting on the front steps. He was alone, his suit jacket folded beside him, tie loosened. She parked her car and approached quietly, noticing the worry lines across his brow. "You all right?" she asked. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Just thinking about how fast time is moving. I only got to know them as teenagers, and now they're heading off in different directions." He paused, glancing at the sky as if searching for answers. "I feel like I'm losing them all over again." Courtney's voice softened. "They're not gone. They're just growing up. You're part of their lives now, whether they're here in this house or halfway across the country." She set her grocery bags down, taking a seat next to him. A fleeting memory rose of them sitting on the stoop of his old dorm in college, dreaming of the future. How different reality had turned out. "I guess so," he said, forcing a smile. "But with Carl, I'm not even sure where I stand. He's so distant." Courtney nodded. "He's deciding his next steps. He'll come around in his own time." She hesitated, then added, "I'm thankful you're here for them now. Better late than never." He looked at her with a flash of gratitude. For once, there wasn't animosity or regret clouding the moment. Just two parents, each humbled by past mistakes, trying to ensure a better future for their children. A gust of wind rattled the branches overhead, and Courtney stood, brushing dust off her jeans. "I should put these groceries away." "If you want, you can come in. The kids should be home soon. Leah's drafting a list of dorm essentials. Maybe you could help her." Patrick stood, slipping on his jacket. "Sure," he replied, picking up two of the grocery bags. As they walked inside together, a sense of uneasy but heartfelt solidarity settled between them. The house might soon be emptier, but the bonds they were forging with the kids and with each other were just beginning to take shape in a brand new way. 2 years later, the world had taken on new rhythms. Leah thrived in her pre-law program in Ohio, occasionally calling Patrick to share updates on her mock trial successes or to discuss court cases she found fascinating. Noah was knee-deep in a competitive engineering curriculum, returning home during breaks to excitedly present prototypes of small robotic gadgets he'd designed. Emily's art continued to flourish at the local institute. She held her first gallery, showing that featured a collection of evocative portraits capturing the emotional evolution of her family. One painting depicted a large dining table, half buried in shadows, yet illuminated by spots of vibrant color where each sibling's seat was represented. It was a quiet masterpiece, reflecting Emily's keen eye for the tension and beauty within her own life. Carl had taken a different path. He decided on a part-time job at a sporting goods store while exploring a sports administration course at a local community college. He lived at home, occasionally commuting to see friends, still searching for that one pursuit he felt truly passionate about. Courtney suspected he found comfort in the routine, a simpler way to figure out his future without the upheaval of leaving home. On a chilly Thanksgiving break, the family reconvened under Courtney's roof. The sense of baked turkey and sweet potatoes filled the house with an almost nostalgic warmth. One by one, the siblings arrived. Leah chatted about her roommate's bizarre study habits. Noah hauled in a massive duffel bag stuffed with textbooks. Emily carried a portfolio of fresh artwork, and Carl, who had never left, welcomed them all with a casual shrug that hid his genuine excitement. Patrick was invited too. Over the past 2 years, a pattern had emerged. The kids now viewed him as part of the family, even if Carl still kept a wary distance. Courtney noticed how each child's relationship with Patrick had become multifaceted. Leah was the most professionally aligned with him, seeking career advice. Noah enjoyed their intellectual debates. Emily shared her art updates, often requesting constructive critique. And Carl, well, Carl tolerated him, and that was progress in its own way. As dusk settled, they all gathered around the dining table, a bigger table than Courtney had when they were children, but somehow it still felt crowded with laughter, chatter, and overlapping conversations. Margaret Miller was there, too, exchanging pleasantries with Eleanor Donovan, the 2 grandmothers now comrades in doting on the family. Vivian dropped by with a casserole dish, greeting everyone warmly and making jokes about the day Courtney first brought 4 crying infants into her dorm room for Vindication Day. Eventually, Noah raised a glass. "I propose a toast," he said, voice trembling with the awkwardness of a young adult learning to speak in a crowd. "To my parents, who have taught us that it's never too late to try and make things right." He looked from Courtney to Patrick. "I know we have a complicated history, but we appreciate what both of you bring to our lives. Thanks for sticking with us." Courtney's eyes brimmed with tears. She had never expected to hear her son acknowledge Patrick as a parental figure so openly. Leah and Emily tapped their glasses, and even Carl gave a slight nod, his expression softening. When they clinked their glasses together, the sound resonated like a gentle bell, signaling something precious. A hard-won family unity, still imperfect, but undeniably real. After dinner, as plates were cleared away, Courtney found Patrick standing alone by the living room mantel, where countless family photos were displayed. Among them was a snapshot taken at the quadruplets' 18th birthday, Patrick's, Courtney, and the 4 teens, all with tentative but genuine smiles. "They were so young," he murmured, brushing a finger over the glass frame. "Time really flies." Courtney approached, setting down a stack of folded napkins. "It does. And I guess we've finally learned how to work together instead of fighting." He nodded, turning to face her. "I never fully apologized for everything. Not just leaving you, but all the years after when I kept my distance. I thought it was too late. I thought you hated me, and maybe you had good reason." He paused, a raw confession in his gaze. "Thank you for letting me back into their lives." She inhaled, pushing down the swirl of memories, her wedding gown abandoned at the church, the positive pregnancy test, the heartbreak of raising 4 children alone. We can't rewrite the past, Patrick. But we can try to do better now, she said softly. They needed you, and I'm glad you stepped up. I've had to let go of a lot of anger, but I think it's healthier for all of us. A comfortable silence wrapped around them, the living room filled with the low hum of conversation from the kitchen. For a fleeting moment, Courtney felt a pang of wonder, how different life might have been if they had stayed together. But she dismissed it with a gentle acceptance. They were, in some ways, the family they never thought they'd become, forged through heartbreak and resilience. "Court," Emily's voice called from the doorway. "We're going through the new paintings I brought. Come take a look." Courtney smiled at Patrick, then turned to join her daughter. Behind her, she sensed him lingering by the mantel, perhaps reflecting on the photos one more time. The echo of the past still lingered, but it no longer dominated. In its place was a renewed sense of possibility, proof that the bonds of family, once shattered, could, over time and with effort, be pieced back together into something surprisingly strong. 3 years had passed since the moment Patrick and Courtney first locked eyes in the family courtroom, the day old wounds were forcibly reopened. Now, the house Courtney once maintained in pristine order for 4 growing teenagers felt strangely quiet. With Leah and Noah away at college, Carl working full-time while taking night classes, and Emily planning her next art showcase, Courtney no longer filled every minute with color-coded schedules. Yet in this new stillness, she sensed her own renewal. Precision Accounts had grown, expanding into a modest suite of offices downtown with a handful of employees. She no longer felt the same fear of instability. Somewhere along the way, she had found the courage to trust her own capacity to handle unexpected changes. On a crisp Saturday afternoon, she met Patrick at a cafe near the old church where, once upon a time, they'd planned to exchange vows. Ironically, the place was now a popular brunch spot, renovated with large windows and a sleek interior design. They chose a corner table, each with a coffee in hand, the day's sunlight slanting across the polished floors. Patrick set down his cup. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet," he said quietly. "It's been a while since we had time to talk without the kids around or a lawyer present." Courtney nodded, offering a small smile. "Agreed. We're overdue for a catch-up. How's the practice?" He ran a hand through the graying hair at his temples. "Busy. I ended up developing a division focused on family law, especially around better reunification methods." His voice carried a hint of gratitude. "I realized how often parents botch these cases because they focus on winning a fight instead of healing a family. I wanted to help people avoid our mistakes." She tilted her head, studying him. "That's meaningful, Patrick. Really. I'm glad you found a way to turn all this into something constructive." He exhaled, as though momentarily unsure how to proceed. "How about you? Precision Accounts is doing well." Courtney couldn't help a flash of pride. "Better than I expected. We've added new services, and I even have an assistant manager now. It's strange. Once upon a time, I thought juggling 4 kids alone was the biggest challenge I'd ever face. Now, expanding the business while balancing these adult children's transitions is a whole different adventure." They shared a chuckle, an ease that would have been unimaginable just a few years prior. For a moment, Courtney let herself recall the version of Patrick she'd first fallen for, idealistic, warm, a bit anxious under his father's shadow. She could see glimmers of that man now, shaped by years of mistakes and regrets, but also by growth. "So," she began, folding her hands on the table, "what do you think happens next with, the kids almost fully grown?" Patrick lifted his coffee, sipping thoughtfully. "They'll keep finding their paths, I guess. I've tried to be a resource for Leah whenever she has a legal question, and Noah calls me every other week to brainstorm science projects. Emily invites me to her art shows. Carl's the toughest, but we did catch a basketball game together last month. It was nice. Courtney's eyes flickered at the mention of Carl. She knew how significant that shared outing must have been. "I'm glad," she murmured. "You've come a long way with them." He set the coffee down, leaning forward. "I owe that to you, Courtney. You didn't have to let me in. You could have fought harder in court, made sure I never got the chance to know them, but you didn't." A surge of emotion welled in her chest. "I did fight at first. But then I realized fighting was draining me more than letting go. Letting you in didn't mean I was excusing what you did. It just meant I was giving our children permission to form their own judgments. They deserved that chance." He nodded, swallowing as though words were caught in his throat. Finally, he spoke, voice low. "I realize we'll never be what we once dreamed of being, but I also don't want us to be strangers who only talk about the kids' schedules. Maybe one day, when enough time has passed, we can be friends of some kind." Courtney's eyes misted. She blinked rapidly, reminding herself to stay grounded. "Yes, friends," she echoed. "I think we're already on our way there." They shared a soft smile, neither pressing for more. The moment was tender, two people acknowledging their flawed history, yet choosing a cautious hope for whatever future remained. No grand reconciliation, no romantic reproposal. Just two individuals standing at a place of mutual respect, bound forever by four remarkable kids who had, in their own ways, forgiven both parents for their failings. When they finished their coffees and stood to leave, the sunlight outside felt warmer than expected, casting a glow on the old church's renovated façade. They walked to their respective cars, parting with a gentle wave rather than a final goodbye. If anything, they both sensed that their story, once so violently fractured, had found a new chapter, one shaped not by bitterness, but by growth. Courtney slid into her car, resting her hands on the steering wheel. For a fleeting moment, tears pricked her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. She thought of her children, each forging new lives, each on the verge of adulthood, and how different things might have been if Patrick had vanished for good. Yet here they were, a family, broken once but now glued back together with acceptance, mutual respect, and a promise of a shared tomorrow. She turned the key in the ignition, letting the engine hum gently. As she pulled away, she cast a final glance in the rearview mirror. Patrick stood by his car, watching her go, a small, grateful smile on his face. The reflection blurred, but the sense of closure remained clear. Sometimes, the hardest journeys end not with a singular grand finale, but with a steady peace, an understanding that life can go on, and love, however delayed, can still become a healing force in the end. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.